Kumeyaay people. They are a people whose traditional life ways intertwine with a worldview of earth and sky in a community of living beings. This land is a part of a relationship that has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced the Kumeyaay people to the present day. It is a part of a world view founded in the harmony of the cycles of the sky and balance and the forces of life. For the Kumeyaay, red and black represent the balance of those forces that provide for harmony within our bodies, as well as the world around us. As students, faculty, staff, and alumni of San Diego State University, we acknowledge this legacy from the Kumeyaay. We promote this balance in life as we pursue our goals of knowledge and understanding. We find inspiration in the Kumeyaay spirit to open our minds and hearts. It is the legacy of the red and black. It is the land of the Kumeyaay. Iyei Hun, my heart is good. And this was written by Michael Connolly of the Campo Band of Kumeyaay, the Kumeyaay Nation. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Shami. Dr. Yellowbird, if you would honor us with a blessing.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you for those good words, Shamis. So I'd just like to start by helping to put our minds in a good place, our hearts in a good place, and by saying some good words. I'll use my tribal language, and I'll talk about what I've said, and how I really hope that that you'll take these words, and keep them with you, especially with this land acknowledgement. So. Nawa, did you weigh gon ho, a dish to do? Nawa de way ganano de wen sagadich, achaguichto. Hey, diwanadina, anunakawa, duena dadich, duena shkado, duena shkado. Shkaguna guguchka, dina shkuna guguchka. Nawa. So, thank you, everyone. In my language, I just said that, I'm here, we're all here together, standing before or sitting before creation. And we find ourselves in this place today where, we bring our spirit and ourselves to this place. And what I ask on behalf of all of your families and your relatives, your loved ones, those that have recently passed, those that are here that are maybe struggling, those that are here that need help, those that are yet to come into the world. I asked for, all of our feet to be all on the same road, this good road together as we struggle through this difficulties, called life. Life's not easy. And that we're here, one heart, one mind, standing the way we are, above again to all creation. Just the way that we are, we bring with us everything that we have, that we should never forget, that even if it's not good, it was hard earned, and there are lessons, attached to it. And finally, the prayer says, we bring ourselves, our minds together, and keep us on the right road as we make our journey, because we're constantly, journeying through this life. And I can tell you, time does not stop for any of us. So it's important, that each of us use our time wisely. So in so many words, that's, what this blessing is all about. So take that with you and keep it with you for all your relatives, your children, your loved ones, your parents, your grandparents, your partners, and even your community people. So I'll just say that much. That's my hope and my words for you. So thank you.
Thank you, Wado, Dr. Yellowbird. I'd like to just take a moment to introduce myself as we get started. My name is Amanda Barrios-Griggs. I am a MSW student at San Diego State University, where I will be graduating. in a few weeks here. Thank you. And my people are Chicano and are Cherokee. And, you know, I feel like a lot of us come from backgrounds that might be different, but a lot of what I hope we're going to learn and discuss today will relate to you in some kind of way, and will touch you in your heart and your work. So I would like to thank Professor Strohauer, who is the advisor for the Indigenous Social Work Alliance, of which I am the president, and all of our members for their assistance in putting together this programming of Decolonizing Social Work Empowerment Series through the funding of a Student Success Fee here at San Diego State University. And with this program, we're hoping to reach conversations that are not necessarily happening in the classrooms that we're experiencing. So we're hoping to kind of bring a new perspective and a new breadth of work that can be explored and developed to apply to the own work that you're doing for yourself. So at this point, I would like to take a moment to introduce Dr. Michael Yellowbird. He is the Dean and Professor of the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. He is an enrolled member of the MHA Nation in North Dakota and has held faculty and administrative appointments at the University of British Columbia, University of Kansas, Arizona State University, Humboldt State University, and North Dakota State University. His research focuses on the effects of colonization and methods of decolonization, ancestral health, intermittent fasting, Indigenous mindfulness, neurodecolonization, mindful decolonization, and the cultural significance of res dogs. He is the founder, director, and principal investigator of the Center for Mindful Decolonization and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba, and he serves as a consultant, trainer, and senior advisor to several BIPOC mindfulness groups and organizations who are seeking to incorporate mindfulness practices, philosophies, and activities to indigenize and decolonize Western mindfulness approaches in order to address systemic racism and engage in cultural structural change. He is the author of numerous scholarly articles, book chapters, research reports, and the co-editor of 4 books: For Indigenous Eyes Only, The Decolonizing Handbook, Indigenous Social Work Around the World, and Decolonizing Social Work. His most recent co-authored mindfulness article is titled Defunding Mindfulness: While We Sit on Our Cushions, Systemic Racism Runs Rampant. Please welcome Dr. Michael Yellowbird.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Amanda. I always think that when those bios get a little too long for me, but I appreciate you sitting through that all. Appreciate it. So I want to just go ahead and jump into my presentation. I think how much time do we have? I should know this, but
we have until 6 p.m.
We have time.
3 hours.
Okay, so hopefully maybe we can take a break in between. So hopefully it's interesting enough. And if folks have questions along the way, I'm happy to answer questions along the way because I've got a lot of material here. So I'm going to share my screen and just give me a nod if you can see it. Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. So what I think about when I think about decolonizing social work, I think about ceremony and the power and the profoundness that ceremony has, to change circumstances for all of us. And in the work that I do, which I refer to as neurodecolonization, the decolonization of the mind, and mindfulness, how can we use these different kinds of ceremonial, traditional kinds of contemplative practices to shift the paradigm, really for Indigenous people, but for the rest of the world. This is my oldest daughter, Arundhati Kuka, which means, Arundhati means, there is peace, and Kuka, my language, means in the morning, at first light. So at the first light, there's this peace that exists in the world. And she's, of course, meditating. And one of the things that I've done with my older sons and 4 younger daughters is to teach them contemplative practices. I have a strong affinity for those because I was raised in a community where contemplative practices, not necessarily mindfulness, but a lot of contemplative practices were used in ceremony to get our minds right, to focus on healing, to focus on the words, to focus on songs, to focus on, those bits and pieces that were happening, in the community, despite all the different colonization aspects that were going on. I'm not trying to paint a picture of that we were living in any kind of idyllic way. I was of a generation where there was massive changes happening in the 60s and the 70s, that we were fighting against the systemic racism, with the American Indian movement and also the Black Panther movement and all these other groups that were occupying Wounded Knee and occupying, Alcatraz Island. I was a child of those times, although I knew people were out there. My first mentor, Dr. Ron Lewis, who was the first Native American to get a Ph.D. in social work, was my major professor when I was an MSW student at the University of Milwaukee. And I was so fortunate to have him as a mentor and as a professor and a friend. He was at Wounded Knee. He was at Alcatraz Island. And he was one of the people that helped marshal in and articulate, the framework for the Indian Child Welfare Act. It was passed in 1978. So he was doing all this work. So I was so fortunate. I'm kind of like the second generation of academics in social work after Ron Lewis to occupy, the academy and to bring the ideas of ceremony, of decolonization, and the integrity, of Indigenous cultures, but also a lot of truth telling. What happened to Indigenous people, and I've never been shy about that. So that's what we need in the academy, is that kind of real talk. So what helps me to do that, what helps people that I do is to enter into these contemplative states, to be strong enough to speak your word, to speak your truth, to speak your mind, right? So and not only when you do that does it heal others, but it heals you more than anyone, And so I'm just working on a book right now. I just started working on the book called, it's really about my memoirs, but it's called The Memoirs of a Mindful Res Kid, and about how I first started using contemplative practices of mindfulness and ceremony to get me to where I am at this point, and how it really improved my wellness and sort of helped lift me out of the streams and the shackles of PTSD. That was happening all around me and to myself back on the reservation. That's where I grew up, in North Dakota, the Fort Berthold Reservation, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Rickawa, 3 affiliated tribes. So in a family of 15, 11 boys and 4 girls, which was not unusual back in the day, right? So now today it's like a whole nother world. So when I think about decolonizing social work, what does it mean to me? Well, it means we have to decolonize the mind and cleanse the body. And neurodecolonization is a framework that I've developed. And really what I'm so interested in is, what are the experiences and perceptions of trauma that change our brain structure and function? How does the neuroplasticity of an event change our brain for the better or for the worse? And there's a lot of Western science that's written about that. But there's also a lot of Indigenous knowledge that exists that I'll talk about as I go along, to kind of fill in both sides of the picture. I wonder a lot about how the environment triggers or silences our gene expression. And I wrote a chapter not long ago for a book about healthy Indigenous aging. And I was just so happy to write that, because it reminded me of 3 grandmothers on my reservation that lived to be 108, 101, and one to be 92 years of age. And how the environment that they maintained as, traditional Indigenous women, sustained them through a lot of trauma and a lot of difficulties. And of course, I believe it triggered, epigenetic expressions in them that protected them from, the trauma and the colonization and all these different things that were happening. So I'm very interested in that. I'm interested, in decolonization is what kinds of brain regions get activated when we're in a place where, it's oppressive, or we're in this place where we're liberated from those kinds of things, and we're deep into ceremony, and our bodies and our brains are feeling this sense of freedom, right? how do brain waves change, and how do specialized neurons or brain cells, such as mirror neurons, are affected by our experience? And also, what about our neurotransmitters that relay messages across our brain, and the modulators that bring in information or hold information in, whether it's language, or whether it's trauma, or whether it's, identity, or whether it's, critical thinking, whatever it is, or the lack of critical thinking, right? Modulators affect, how we think and how we, what we believe. And I'm happy to report for many Indigenous people, they had very flexible neuromodulators in the brain, because they had to learn a lot from one another. They had to learn each other's languages, each other's customs, each other's belief systems and values. And there was trade that was happening with Indigenous people all across, Turtle Island, all across the Americas, really. And we know that now, even more clearly, because that history has been sort of laid out, and people take a look at what was happening long before Europeans arrived here. And finally, the last part of it, I won't talk so much about it in this talk, but about the diversity and the processes of the microscopic life that lives on us or within us. I call it, it's called the human microbiome. We don't think about that much in social work, but we do think a lot about mental health and about emotions. And we now know today that the things that we eat, the way, that we feel, the exercises and movement that we do, and all these different kinds of things really affects not only our emotions, but it affects us down to the microbial level. And the microbes, trillions of them in our bodies, exert a lot of different kinds of crosstalk with our own genes that either activate helpful genetic responses or activate, genetic responses that are troublesome. So, these things are all sort of contained and connected together. And that's to me is what neurodecolonization is about. So what I want to talk a bit about tonight, and in this presentation is about, what I've done with the medicine wheel. So some of you probably heard of it, but the medicine wheel is kind of a universal symbol. And you see it a lot in the Great Plains area of the United States and Canada. But, what I've done is kind of updated it a bit to bring Western and Indigenous science and knowledge all together, and how thinking about the medicine wheel can be really critical in helping us to decolonize not only ourselves, but guide us towards achieving personal and community justice for folks, right? And well-being. What can we learn from our Indigenous ancestors, and why they were correct in their worldviews and the ways that they lived, and how they practiced their healing and created community? Those things are pretty clear to me now as I've looked at not only history, but again, I've looked at the neuroscience and the biology and all these and genetic science and all these different kinds of things to think, wow, the way that Indigenous people were living, was in a space or a place that was, really perfect for them to be in, and how they thought and they believed and how they interacted with the environment, right? We hear that a lot, but now we've got even more proof when we start to look, genetically and biologically and so on. I'll talk about a few, terms in neuroscience and microbial science and genetic science and their relevance to mindful decolonization and decolonizing social work. Let's see here. So again, these are just some other things: current science, traditional knowledge, regarding trauma, cognitive resilience, and so on. The neuroscience of contemplative practices, to me, which I found so fascinating when I think about all the traditional things that Indigenous people have done, and what goes on in the brain, what goes on in the body when people are engaged in these really sacred kinds of practices, right? Things that we didn't know, what we know now, we can look at in real time, because we've got this interesting brain imaging and body imaging stuff that can give us an idea of what's happening, and how when we engage in these things, it begins to create within us, dynamic changes that lead to wellness, right? Also other things that, again, we don't talk so much about how do we adapt to stress in our lives, right? What's the important role of that? Mild bioenergetic stress, as they call it, in terms of decolonization and implications for our wellness. Toward the end of the talk, I'm going to talk about genetic variants and epigenetic circumstances that prime us for trauma or protect us from trauma, or they short circuit our wellness. And there are some evolutionary fixes for our genetic blueprint. And a lot of them really have to do with kind of returning to a really mindful, traditional, Indigenous lifestyle. So I'll get to that in a moment here. So neurodecolonization, these are my two youngest daughters, two oldest daughters. Now she's 15 and she's 13. But this is when they're in my office at Humboldt State University, which is now Cal Poly Humboldt, I guess. They changed their name. So it's now Cal Poly. So what is neurodecolonization is that when we engage in evolutionary mind-body practices, we can actually begin to decolonize and heal and liberate our brain from all these effects of colonization. We can also use decolonization as a tool for active resistance to the forces of colonization that perpetuate or subjugate, our minds and exploit our feelings and our bodies and so on. The ultimate purpose, that Waziatuin and myself, when we wrote for Indigenous Eyes Only, talked about is that, we want to overturn the colonial structure. We're not talking about burning down buildings. We're talking about the structures that are in place that, keep us oppressed or that sort of corral us and limit our creativity and our expression of ourselves and our culture. And that's what indigenous liberation is all about, is having that capacity to do those kinds of things. And finally, the drum roll is that first and foremost, I believe very deeply that decolonization has to begin in our own minds. That's the first thing. So if we started to take a look at, the medicine wheel, the whole system. Now, enough research shows us that, we are these whole systems, right? That we have this interactive talk going on between our genes and our brain and our gut axis and our brain axis, inflammatory T cells, immune cells. All this talk is going on inside of our bodies, based upon our perception of the world and the experiences that we have. That then in itself then affects, our genetic expression, our microbial diversity in population, our cellular, molecular health systems, and our lifestyles and our communities. All these things are shaped by the relationship we had with our environment. So we're coming down, from people that lived in an environment like you're talking about now. You're just talking about the people whose land that you're on right now. I'm in Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba, Canada, the land of the Ojibwe, the Dakota, the Cree, OJ-Cree, the Dene people, and the Métis people, right? So all these people had different kinds of relationships with land and lived here for thousands and thousands of years and even longer, who knows how long. But, when folks were here, they really started to kind of make their mark upon the land. And when you look at the medicine wheel or the sacred hoops, they're really about, people's constant striving for balance and harmony and peaceful interactions with all living things, right? I mean, there was a cost. I just had a conversation with some folks not long ago about the collapse of societies, right? And societies that succeed and others that sort of collapse. And generally, the historical record shows that people who can roll with the changes and adapt to those changes without doing too much damage to the environment, or the other beings that live around them, these are the cultures that continue to thrive and they don't collapse. So the medicine wheel kind of has these sacred cycles of life in there: the birth, life, death, rebirth, right? The four cardinal directions are, in my case of my tribes, semi-cardinal directions: the north, south, east, west, or for us, it's the southeast, southwest, northwest, northeast. All these directions have their own teachings and they're representative of all forms of life. The medicine wheel, as you may know, represents all these elements: air, water, fire, earth, the basic elements of all human beings. And we think about that. And the connecting points for Mother Earth and Father Sky. And the final point, of course, is the center, which is really the human being, represents and how we connect with all these elements. So we're sort of constantly in this center of these things, or part of it. I shouldn't say the center. So if we were to kind of travel back in time, what would the medicine wheel look like on Turtle Island, and really what would be happening, right? And again, I think the implications are very strong about holistic, social work or decolonized social work. Well, one of the things we know is that there's the medicine wheel in the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming, which is now Wyoming. This particular set of stones has been around for 10,000 plus years. It's been radiocarbon dated to be very, very old. but it's just kind of a drop in the bucket in terms of the lifespan and in the evolution of human beings, right? So if we were to kind of be in a drone floating above it, this is what it would look like several years ago. So if you can imagine, at one time that the Turtle Island, was just alive with different groups of tribal people that were moving from east to west, north to south. And I always like to kind of look at it in terms of the trade routes that were happening all the way from the California west coast to the east coast, of the Haudenosaunee people, and from the south, from Mexico, and all the way from north, from the Arctic Circle. People were moving to central parts of Turtle Island, in trade. So they would bring their trade, a few hundred miles, and then another group would bring it further down. So these items got to, these different places and connecting points in Turtle Island. This is one of those connecting points where a lot of different tribes came to spend time in this sacred place, right? And there was a meeting place. And if you could imagine for a moment that, let's see if I can get my laser pointer here. If you can imagine for that one time that people were camped, along here, different tribes of people, all sort of occupying this place, and they were coming, and they were laying down their weapons, and they were being, this part of the medicine wheel, and they were contemplating, and they were exchanging information, prayers, kind of in this whole, holistic way, talking about the cosmos and of course life, and existence and those kinds of things. So ideas were being exchanged, goods were being exchanged, ceremonies were being exchanged, and that's who we are really as an Indigenous people. We're a hybridity of one another. They've been exchanging these kind of earth ceremonies for a long time. So if we were kind of to look at it today, we would see that, of course, if you haven't been up there, maybe you've been up there, that it's now protected, it's roped off. But you can still see, that the Indigenous people of today are still living, like medicine, or dream catchers, and sacred cloth, and all kinds of, there's a tobacco pouch here, and all kinds of things. And that they're coming, leaving prayer offerings. And this is what Indigenous people do. The land to them is very sacred. The land to us and our ancestors was what, we're not here, without the land. The land is, what we're made of. And so people leave these tobacco ties, these feathers, these different kinds of sacred ties there, around there. And of course, the prayers are left there. So it's a sacred place like there are in the world. And it always reminded me a lot of, Buddhist prayer flags, in Tibet and other places, that they put all the prayers on the flags of the different colors and send it out to the universe. What happens, in the Great Plains area when we go to a Sundance, a lot of people are there, in the circle, like the medicine wheel, and they are, bringing their prayers up. And I was a Sundancer for many years, staff carrier for my reservation, my Sundance and so on, and that I had the opportunity to be in that circle many times, to send out prayers for the world, for the people. And it's not something you can just do and say, well, I did that. It's something that constantly needs to be done. And so that's what we see. We see that, in places like North Dakota where there are hardly any Indigenous people, that people are drawn to that. So they create these, prototypes. This is at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas. I was a professor at the University of Kansas, and Haskell Indian Nations University was just down the road a bit, but it was a boarding school at one time. And of course, after a while, the students and administration began to kind of remake the place, and they built this beautiful big medicine wheel out there, and in the grasslands, in the wetlands of the area, and Haskell Indian Nations University. And then, of course, you see people walking in. Of course, this big group of people. Maybe they're tourists, maybe they're people all going to pray, but they're there to kind of see this place and this, the development of this. And so, in my travels, I was invited down to Cullowhee, North Carolina, to do some work with the Cherokee North Carolina people. And as I was talking to elders and some of the spiritual leaders, they really wanted to, and I was talking about contemplative practices and social work. They wanted to bring me out to this place where there's called Judakula Rock. And they just told me the stories about it. And all these lines on there, all the carvings that are on there. And so, as we talked about it, then I got to see a picture more close up. These are some of the carvings in that rock. So you can see that this is from, estimated from the late Archaic period, 3,000 years ago, right? What symbols do you see? And this is always the one always catches my mind first, where this creature, this being, or whatever it is with these looking suction cups looking on their head is traveling up this road here with this other, might be a social worker, right? With this kid went this way. And, taking this trail, and along the trail, running into these really interesting creatures or symbols, right? Moving back and forth and then going up and stopping on the way. And then, of course, seeing these animals or creatures as they go up, to wherever they're going up the top of the rock, maybe they're going to the cosmos or whatever, maybe the dreams were there. And you see, people on journeys like this, looks like a human figure there kind of on a journey. I laughed, before there was the coronavirus, I looked at them and said, oh, that's kind of reminds me of that, But, these think about that 3,000 years ago, that people were, coming up with these images all over. And so when you look to this side of the rock, you see this larger sort of picture that looks like a turtle. Looks like Turtle Island. And that's what people, I guess it was. And in the center of it, of course, is a medicine wheel, right? So 10,000 years ago, in the Bighorn, what is now the Bighorn Mountains, people had assembled and created a medicine wheel. 7,000 years later, it showed up on the East Coast in what is now Cherokee country in Cullowhee, North Carolina. And as we look at that, we begin to see that symbol, those spokes, like that medicine wheel that we saw. And of course, we see, people, this got to be, at least, 1,500s, maybe people had horses even before that, some people say. So you just see some of those symbols again. And these are Indigenous people, leaving symbols of like, we're here. This is our mark, right? This is who we are. Mojave Desert, sun sign. I'm back at my own reservation in North Dakota, Fort Berthold, the Mandan, Hidatsa, Wickaron Nation. So you see this medicine wheel here that was put together after a Sundance one year by young people. I was one of those young people at that time. And, it was a symbol just to kind of see people when they're coming into our territory. They could see, that there's still a belief in this way of life, and this connecting points. Some more medicine wheel. This creature, whatever it is, some people say it's a whale in the desert, but there's a medicine wheel here. So we continue to see that, that wheel, that symbol of connecting. So in my own work, I've taken a look at that medicine wheel, and I said, how can it be used, to be a holistic approach to neurodecolonization and mindfulness and community health and decolonizing social work? So when I looked at the mind part, I thought, well, what if we bring in some of the things that we know that happen to our brains, and our brains change, under different circumstances. They heal and they thrive when there's positive, and there's hope, right? And that's the neurogenesis. There are more neurons, or that changes the shape and the structure and the function with the neuroplasticity. So we know that it's this holistic model, right? And that our culture, our experiences, perceptions, all these different kind of things shape the plasticity. And what I mean by that is that we change, we adapt, we have this ability to kind of shape shift, even at the molecular level. And we're changing all the time, depending upon the kind of information that we're putting into our bodies, into our minds, into our, through ceremony or just having an experience. Right? And when I look at this, I think about, what's the most important part of the mind? That there's this is just a couple things, examples, that I'm writing about. The other part is like, what about the body besides running and moving and being well? What about this microbial life that lives inside of us that has all these different kinds of functions that I now term the new great circle of life, and that exerts such a powerful influence on our health and well-being, our mental health, and these are the contemplative practices, the part of the spirit, some of the things like mindfulness or ceremony, where we do those kinds of things. And of course, this part is kind of like our evolutionary heritage we got from our ancestors. We've got certain genetic markers from our ancestors that were meant to protect us, that were meant to sustain us, when times got hard, as long as we followed the trail that they had left for us, whether it was social, political, spiritual, intellectual, any of those kinds of things, and and so on. So, how do we recover, from the diseases of colonization? And I'm convinced totally, I've kind of banked most of my work on this now, is that we have to rediscover ancestral knowledge and practices. It's critical. And that's where social work can be very, very much in the lead, is to move people towards, working with communities towards rediscovering their ancestral knowledge and practices. Because you'll see as the talk goes along, that there are so many things that we can do that are ancestral, that are fairly easy to access and do, but have these profound sort of payoffs for us as individuals. I'm not saying it, in any way, you want to be humble and have humility about it, but it helps, with the integrity and the development and the well-being of the person. So, because we have a brain that has plasticity and can change, because we have a human microbiome that, that supports us and it can change one way or the other depending on how we treat it, and our genetic inheritance, all these things are all plastic. They can all be changed, with thinking and emotions and feelings and doings and so on. I believe they can be traditional return to practice, traditional practices. What are those practices? Simply things like movement and things we never thought about. Sleep, how powerful sleep is, and the importance of laughter, humor. And I'm going to show you some really important reasons why that's so important in terms of genetics, about collectivism. More than most people, Indigenous people, the other populations that have been collective cultures for a long time, that have not spent a lot of time in Western industrial society. And some of our ancestors, were in Western industrial society just for a few hundred years. I think about Southern California when I think about some of the tribes down there that were just, getting introduced to this really subtle culture that was coming in and dealing with that. And people in Canada, the same thing. We're just getting introduced to Southern colonialism in that kind of way, where there are different kinds of things are getting did. So contemplative collectivism is just so important, to keep our numbers alive. Things I mentioned, my part of my bio says intermittent fasting, and again, I'll talk a bit about why that's important. Contemplative practices, of course, adaptive stress, all the way down to outdoors, are things that I've kind of put into this model now. So if we were to go back and to think about colonization just for a moment, and like, what is colonization? Well, people have talked about it a lot, but I just wanted to kind of be clear what it means to me in terms of coming in and being an unwelcome or intrusion or invasion of one group by another. Right? It could be animals, could be insects, could be plants. Whatever the invasive species comes in and invades, or is set loose there, just like COVID-19 was an unwelcome invasion and intrusion into our lives. And of course, once we were exposed to that, a contamination period took place. And of course, once the infection set in, our immune systems became overwhelmed, and death and sickness set in. You can say the same thing on a cultural or social level too as well. ideas of, beliefs and value systems can be invasive. And there can be a period of when those ideas and beliefs and values are pushed upon a people or a group, that they can contaminate that group, and that kind of contact can be very, very harmful in interactions with that, because people then begin to move too quickly away from who they are, and to try to and be brought into a system where they have not really adapted to, in terms of evolutionary adjustments, and so on. But then there's that period after contamination where, as I said, we get overwhelmed, immunity and deaths and sickness sets in. We saw that with disease, with smallpox in my tribe, invasion, traders came in, then the contamination of hanging out with folks, and then, of course, the spreading of smallpox blankets and infection. 1837, our tribes, the Mandan, Hudas, and Mandans were wiped out to about 95% of the people. The Rickaras, my dad's people, lost about 75% of the people, and my mom's people, she's also a Rickara, but she's also Hudas, lost about over 50% of the people, just wiped them out. So that was being overwhelmed. And then the people that were left then were the actual ones that got colonized by the system, right? Those that survived the first 3 stages of colonization, then that colonization became part of our lives, no longer overwhelmed in there and thrive in there. And within the colonial state. But, folks are still vulnerable today, which I think is why we see so much suicide among groups, Indigenous groups. We see a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety disorders. And I'll talk about it as we go along. I think that is, I think I've found some really clear understanding now why, when we as social workers work with different groups of people, why we work with populations that, get chronically ill, and metabolic diseases like diabetes and so on, but anyway, that's colonization. Decolonization in my model then is a period when a person understands innovation is happening. And it's like, what we do at the academy, I think in social work, there's a cleansing period that we want to strip away all the harmful, invasive beliefs and practices and thoughts and values that were imposed by these colonizing structures, right? That said these people, didn't have any value. We need to treat land this way. We need to do those kinds of things, which are all these very harmful things. As we scrub those away, we move to the next period of Renaissance, right? And I see a lot of that happening today, especially in particular areas like land-based education. There's a lot of people doing work on food sovereignty, and different kinds of things, right? There's a lot of young Indigenous women running for political office, which is a restoration of, the women's role, in political society. It's pretty clear that it was very strong in many societies, women's presence, in decision making. So that Renaissance began to begin to bring back those things that were taken away or abandoned during the period of colonization. But they're still relevant and necessary for survival and well-being. So if we sat down, we could do a list of, so many things that we need to restore. Finally, the last piece is the period. And again, we are, as Indigenous people, as I said, we are a hybrid type of people. We can not only birth new ideas, thinking and technologies and use them, but we also remember that, we traded with one another, traded ideas and ceremonies. We traded, innovations, people who were hunter-gatherer populations, my folks, my people, were horticulturalists, gave people corn and beans and squash and different kinds of things. And of course, what did they give us? Well, they gave us, ceremony. They gave us songs, different kinds of knowledge. So we're always sort of part of one another in that way, that exchange of information, that exchange of material. So that's the enlightenment part about it, is that we survive as human beings by to adapt, to be able to use whatever it is that we have at our disposal to use it in the way we need to use it. So and this is just another look at what the decolonization is about. Like there was the other world that our ancestors lived in, and of course during the period of invasion and colonization, that world fell and was reborn into this world, where we have such a large, strong need for social workers to go and work in communities because of intimate, partner violence or lateral violence or substance abuse or different kinds of health problems. We're reborn to this world where colonialism has really had that kind of effect on us. But as we decolonize and when we scrub ourselves from that colonization, remember, and the next level is the renaissance of those ideas, and this world begins to die, and we arise to become a new world, another world, right? Maybe more like our ancestors, but not exactly like our ancestors. But this is kind of the theme and march of human societies across the world. They come and they overshoot and collapse their ability to kind of take care of one another and to sustain their populations because they damage the environment, or they have warfare, or they have really sort of big differences between the genders, or violence happens, or maybe societies become too warrior culture-like, or they become too this or that, whatever. Those worlds are affected when it's out of balance, and of course they fall. So that's the idea, just kind of in the model, to think about that cycle. Where are we at, in this world? How much of it is it dying, and what's, and what are we going to rise to? Right? So in this particular slide, this is from our book for Indigenous Minds Only, published back in 2013. I can't believe it's been like 9 years since we did this book, but but when I talk about neurodecolonization, neuroplasticity, I talk about, neurodecolonization refers to the neurons in the brain that fire, and the specialized cells that send electric signals throughout the body. Decolonization, of course, the second part of the term is, again, like I said, activities that weaken the effects of colonization, facilitate resistance, create opportunities to promote traditional practices in present-day setting. In this particular picture here, what we were trying to convey with this picture, my brother my younger brother actually did this picture. He goes by the artist named Black Pinto Horse. So I asked him to do the cover for our book, and he did this cover. and so I was a little bit, what does it mean? Because he said, well, you remember how you're always talking about the brain and neurons? I said, yeah. He said, well, these horses here represent the neurons as they fire from the prefrontal cortex and from, the occipital lobe. This is that purple horse head here, and from the here, and these other parts of the brain, which are, about movement and so on. And so these are things, like you have to move to get back to, where you need to be. So those are the ones that are firing, the neurons that are firing. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain about the thinking and planning of how to get there. The purple part is the seeing part of the brain, the occipital lobe. So this little horse helps us see. And so, and on and on. The parietal lobe is kind of the spiritual part. That's up there. So he's telling me about that. And because I explained all that to him, so he was thinking about it. And he said, well, then we've got these two holy people here. Back to the ceremony. So in order for the brain to, fire its neurons in an appropriate way, we have to have, holy songs sung to the brain. So, okay. So this man singing to the brain, this holy person. This other person here, then, of course, is smudging the brain, and blessing the brain to help all this happen. This woman here is the woman who makes everything grow, because we come from a traditional horticultural society. And if you had the book in front of you, you could see her finger kind of has this point of light, to give life, and how women in the culture, occupy that position in our Rikara tribe. They were highly, highly respected. No such thing as intimate partner violence against women, or abuse. It was like suicide, spiritual suicide, to treat one another in that way. So here we see the horses and the neurons going back to where? They're going back to the lodges, to the tradition. And that's kind of what we're trying to do in decolonizing social work is to kind of say, tradition is where it's always been. And that's why, one of the first things that colonists and settler colonialism attacked was the traditions of the people. That was their keystone strength, was the spirituality and the connection they had to the land. Of course, the connection they had to this kind of traditional way of life. So neurodecolonization then means we're combining all these different kinds of mindfulness approaches, right? The traditional and contemporary practices. And the whole idea then is to resculpt neurons in the brain and the way the brain works, and replace those problematic, negative parts of the colonized brain, productive, healthy, positive, new emotions and behaviors. And that's what, is commonly now referred to as neuroplasticity. So think about, just a second. When we think about the idea of decolonization and neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, what mean in terms of decolonizing the mind? Well, for me, it means that, we have to take these approaches that are going to change the brain and change the body in kinds of ways, and samples that, are not just things I thought about, but things that our ancestors used to do. But now in the scientific Western literature, things like movement, running, singing, dancing, sleep, laughter, all these things I mentioned before, which seem to be like the perfect toolbox of social work practice, decolonized social work practice. So if we were to go back to this part of the medicine wheel here and say, well, what is neuroplasticity and neurogenesis all about in the brain? What does that mean? And how does that relate to healing? And how do traditional healing secular practices help us to achieve that? So then to this kind of slide, or this slide here, and talk about 12 mindfulness practices that can really actually heal emotions, reset our genetic expression. Beyond that, it resets a lot of other molecular integrity and cellular activity and so on. I'll get to that in just a minute and show you what I mean by that. And facilitate improved learning and understanding, and well-being. So, believe it or not, if we were all practicing decolonized social work with Indigenous people, we'd be all studying running or movement and dancing and singing. We'd all be understanding, the importance of sleep and how our ancestors slept very differently than we sleep today. And why is that such a big deal? And also about humor and laughter, why that's so critical in being together as collectivist groups. What about, going without, right? What did that do for us? What about meditation? What about adaptive stress? What about being outside? All these different kinds of things. So if we move to, I won't talk about this parasites here, but if we move to this particular slide here, we know now that when we look at people and we understand, what's happened to people in this day and age, is that we are not as strong as our ancestors. We're not as mobile as our ancestors because we've changed the way that we live. We don't walk very far. We don't exercise much. We drive most of the time. So our bones and our bodies have gotten smaller, more vulnerable to injury, and on and on and on. But we evolved to move. We evolved to run, and our biology and physiology supports that. Persistence running, running after our food is in our heritage. It may seem weird to us now because most of us are born at a time where we didn't have to do that. I thankfully was one of those people that, and I count myself fortunate. I grew up, in a family that we were hunters. We were subsistence hunters back on my reservation in North Dakota. So we had to do a lot of persistence running after our game. We hunted on foot, we hunted on horseback, and so on. That's how we fed ourselves, right? Partly how we fed ourselves. And my mom and parents and relatives had big gardens, so we had all these things we did. We didn't have any access to a store. That was a long ways away, and we could go once in a while, but money was always an issue, and so on. So what does persistence running do? What does it mean? Well, it means that it improves our fitness, our physical and mental health. And I can state that enough, that it improves our emotional health as well. improves the brain's working memory, processing speed, and our brain's executive function, which is critical to our ability to delay gratification, to sit back and to be mindful about, like, I need this, I don't need this right now. I'm just, here, and also to avoid distraction, which is to be very, again, focused, like our ancestors used to be. They delayed their gratification because they didn't always have a lot of food to eat. But our genetics adapted to that, which is really interesting now today. You see that happening. So we call intermittent fasting or calorie restriction world that, people have written books and books and sold millions and millions of dollars worth of these books on something that's really an ancestral practice to delay gratification, not eating 7 meals a day, like ad libitum, like we do in Western society, industrialized society, and avoiding distraction, right? I mean, that's the thing, is that cell phones, all kinds of other things that are competing for our attention. And of course, our ability to improve our cognitive flexibility, meaning that, it was life and death, for our ancestors to be able to move from one cognitive task smoothly to the next task, without getting tripped up, right? And so we developed genetic profiles for these kinds of things to be able to do that kind of thing, right? And what's colonized our brains, of course, is the distraction and the competition for our attention, that exists in industrial society. And cognitive flexibility isn't there because, a lot of times people are taught one idea, there's one way to do things. So it's difficult for us to move from one idea to the next, to accept diversity, to accept difference, right? We live in a very much a monocultural kind of society, or where, we're not like our ancestors who spoke, 7 different languages. We're very monosyllabic in that way. We speak one language, maybe most of us do, or 2 languages, right? What does movement do and running do? Well, critical. This is, again, something that we should all learn about in social work, is BDNF, which is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's a protein in the brain that, when it increases, it's like miracle growth for the brain. It increases the number of neurons in the brain and actually protects us against dementia and Alzheimer's. Movement also initiates what is known as long-term potentiation. Neurons that fire together, wire together, means that when we do a task, when we think a thought, whether it's a pleasant thought or a really depressed thought or an angry thought, when we practice that over and over again, our neurons have to come together to fire, to make sure that we got the color right in our angry thought, we've got the feeling right in our angry thought, we've got the emotion right, we've got the situation right, all these different kinds of things. And as we wire, as we do that, the emotions wire together and they get stronger and stronger. So we support that unhealthy thought more and more. The reverse 180-degree difference is true. The more we focus on, compassion, the more we focus on love and awareness and understanding, the more that our brain goes to let me find the understanding neurons and we'll fire. Let me find the compassion neurons and fire. Let me find the color that goes with the compassion neuron. Maybe it's blue, maybe it's green. I don't know, but whatever your brain is doing. And as you do that more and more, your brain gets thicker in different parts in different regions of the brain. So just like when we run, just like when we exercise, just like when we move, or when we dance, neurons have to fire to wire together, and we get better and better at as we do that. Finally, the last bullet point here, which I think is really kind of again, sort of the whole reason that I think it's so important, is that we now know that there's been a number of studies that show that exercise protects us from depression by increasing skeletal muscle kynurenine aminotransferase. So we just have to remember that when we exercise, we're protected from depression, and by this skeletal muscle, CAT expression, which shifts away this next one, which is the kynurenine metabolism, away from this neurotoxin that builds up in our bodies and our brains, KYN, kynurenine, neurotoxic kynurenine, to a more neutral and productive kynureninic acid. So you tell me if there's any coincidence here, or if there's something to it. I've been in social work for a long time, and I remember when I was at Arizona State University, I was a professor down, and I had students at the Phoenix Indian Hospital. So I used to go over there. That's when I was a professor. Sit down and I'd visit with the psychiatrists, the psychologists, and the students, and some of the physicians and so on. And I would say, well, what's the most diagnosed emotional condition? Depression was always the key thing. And then when you start looking at rates, almost no matter where you go, that Indigenous people are going to have higher rates of depression, right? People say, well, it's because of historical trauma. That's true. When we think about those kinds of things, that we can reenact those whole kinds of trauma all over again, right? When we don't think about them, it doesn't engage, the brain. So it isn't always there. But we also know that, when we go out and people moved, that they were protected then by this, chorionic acid, right? The production of chorionic acid when they were moving. So you have to remember that, our ancestors are just a few hundred years away from, in some cases, just, a couple hundred years away from, walking and running and moving and playing outside, in all kinds of weather conditions. Just that short a period. It wasn't like, we've been evolving, to be in cars or sit in desks, for the last 20,000 years. It's a very, very recent kind of thing that's been happening. So it makes perfect sense why we would see higher levels of depression among Indigenous people just from the lack of movement, right? The lack of running and exercise that our ancestors did. So I found that compelling. The other area is dancing and singing, which is like, wow, this is cool because you think about it, colonization. One of the first things colonization did was take away our movement, took away our ability to kind of move from here to there and, put us on, rancherias or reservations or reserves or put them in these areas, where, we couldn't really move. And now that was the colonization of our movement, right? So when you look at this particular study, it's not too old. It's 4 years old or something. But there's a really interesting bit of study because this particular research found that singing, when people sing, significantly increases levels of different kinds of the A or the OEA and P endocannabinoids in this particular sample of postmenopausal females, right? But it's been since replicated that, we know that singing does that to everybody, right? But it doesn't, for some people, there's a higher rise in the endocannabinoid concentrations in the brain when folks sing. So think about it. I used to think about it for a while and say, wow, when people were encountering our people on the Great Plains, that's what a lot of the settlers were talking about, because Indians were singing all night, and they were singing, and everything they did was sing. They sing about this, they sing about that. It's a lot of singing. Of course, they got their love songs, their war songs, their grief songs, their burial songs, their birth songs, their planting songs, all the different kinds of things, birthday songs, all these different kinds of things, honoring songs, and when I was a kid growing up, I was, again, fortunate to hear a lot of those songs sung by people in the community. We don't hear that so much anymore in my community. But think about it, when people sing about that, and when they're singing about something that excites them and something that makes them feel good, and they're singing round after round, and then they start laughing or whatever, the endocannabinoids are going to go up in the brain. And that's important. Same thing happens with dancing. When people dance, they have this release of high level endocannabinoids. And this is cycling on the bike, where there's another set of endocannabinoids that get activated. Also has these positive effects. And again, singing. Look at this. Most beneficial activity in this particular study. When we look at, endocannabinoids, what are those, right? Well, of course, it's like any cannabinoid would be like marijuana, for example. Is when it comes to mind for most of us, we think about. And that, of course, what we know is that it's used now for health reasons and for pain and to deal with trauma, those kinds of things. But we have our own sets of endocannabinoid concentrations in our brain. And when we do these things, when we dance and we sing and we dance and we run, not only is our brain-derived neurotrophic factor going up, as I said in the last slide, which protects our brain, but look at this. Endocannabinoids also improve our mood, reduce stress and anxiety, enhance memory, protect brain function, and reduce pain. So this one here about protecting, improving mood has to do a lot with depression, right? Stress and anxiety, of course, we see a lot. Enhancing memory and protecting brain function are two things that we see. I just wrote not long ago, I was looking at some data about dementia among Indigenous people, right? And throughout the world, but I was looking at mostly on Turtle Island and saw these rates really kind of going up fast among Indigenous people in North America, Canadian and US Indigenous people. And yet, when you look out across the world, you see hunter-gatherers with the same genetic profile as we have as Indigenous people, but yet very rare and low levels of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. In fact, one group in the Amazon or the Bolivian rainforest, I believe it is, called the Chimene Indians, have been looked at, and their brains, when they get to in their early 70s and even 80s, their brains show 70% less shrinkage than those of us who live in the Western world, meaning that there's very, very remote chance they're going to be getting dementia or Alzheimer's. They're going to die from something else, maybe malaria or something else. So when you think about that and think, wow, what kind of protective factors that singing has, what a protective factor that dancing has. And of course, it's pretty clear that these were some of the first things that were taken away from Indigenous people by colonizers, right? Outlawing language. People always talk about outlawing language, but they also outlaw singing and dancing and movement. But we don't talk about that much. We talk a lot about the outlaw of language. So humor, again, one of those things that comes up in the research. We really know now that humor and laughter is something that we see having DNA differences, right? And this particular study was done by Joan Chiao. You see her, more than 10 years ago, but it's been a lot of sort of research going on in this area. And it's kind of slowed down, but the people with short alleles, and this particular gene, the 5-HTT-LPR, which I just call the funny bone gene, since I'm not a genetic scientist or a neuroscientist, I'm just the way I remember it. People with this particular variant of this particular gene are much more likely to laugh and be amused and smile, when they see things that are funny, right? And what we know about that is people with these short alleles are flourish in a positive environment where there's a lot of smiling, a lot of teasing. There's a lot of us tribes had culturally prescribed teasing. There's trickster stories. There's sacred clowns. There is also this particular kind of humor that people tell stories about, right? And so very, very much in play in a lot of Indigenous communities. So when you move folks from that community where there's not a lot of fun and playtime and laughter and humor into a negative one, where you're in a settler world where everybody's got to be serious, no smiling, no laughing, everything's serious, then people are going to suffer, right? And this is what the research is saying. Well, people with the long alleles, and not surprisingly, who are a lot of them are Western Europeans, who have long alleles, are less sensitive to environmental conditions. So they could, take laughter, take it or leave it, right? But what's important about this is to remember, I think, for many tribal groups, wherever they are, could be Pacific Rim, could be in Africa, could be in Turtle Island. A lot of groups had, even in Europe at one time, they had these court jesters or these sacred clowns that created, positive environment, even in a negative environment. I remember one time at a Sundance. It was a ceremony. I was talking to one of my uncles, and we had just finished Sundance, and we were talking about at the end of Sundance, there's a sacred clown that comes in at the end of Sundance, and we were talking about that, and we began to talk about how sacred clowns come to events and a serious event, and they change the tenor of the event, by doing things that are contrary, right? They're when they're supposed to be serious, they're being noisy. When they're supposed to have a sense of grief, they're making jokes, right? But people understood it in that way. And I said, I remember that. I said, remember when I was a kid that I seen a couple of these sacred clowns coming to these funerals, and they used to do things where I think white folks would think, wow, this is so abominable. This is such abominable behavior. This is so inappropriate, right? But they were brilliant. Indigenous people were brilliant because they were actually bringing people back into balance to remind them that, even death, even calamity, or even tragedy, ends. And this is one of the things we have to remember, is that there's balance. This balance always has to be struck here. And I think that's one of the things that's happened with historical trauma, is that we've never laughed at the historical trauma. Some people have, but we haven't. We've been taught that it's just trauma and that's it. But when you think about a lot of our ancestors, they learned to laugh at trauma. They learned to laugh at death. They learned to count coup on trauma, count coup on death. Otherwise, those lines would have never gone on. And I think that's one of the things that, is really important to understand about humor, how important it is, even in difficulties. And I'll show you why in a couple of slides here. So in this particular study of these 29 nations, this is, this cross-national study, Joan Chiao and her colleagues found that, collectivist cultures, like indigenous cultures, remember, that's who we are, we're significantly more likely to have people who have the funny bone gene, right? So collectivist cultures and humor genetically are just connected, That's what the science says. And then when you start looking in different groups, you start finding out and understanding their humor. So what does humor and laughter do? Again, here's that BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, increases that. Remember, when it increases, it increases neurogenesis, so you're growing more brain cells. And it's increasing, the plasticity of the brain, so that your brain can kind of grow more in a sense, So neurogenesis and plasticity, are very flexible. And it also does things like improve our memory and learning. It protects our brain, lowers cortisol, relaxes our blood vessels, and improves our immune system, and releases endorphins and endocannabinoids. So if we were doing social work practice and we were doing an assessment, one of the things that if I was your practice teacher, I'd say, well, how many times did your families that you work with laugh this week, right? How many times you'd have your levels of laughter, right? Giggle all the way down to belly laugh, and tears and snotty noses and all those kinds of things. Right? And then you go back to them and say, okay, so you check those off. What about how many times did your people in your family sing? How long did they sing? What did they sing? How often did they dance last week? How many times did they, what kind of dances did they do? Who did they dance with, right? How often did they move last week? Right? This is your kind of assessment tool. And I can almost bet, I would suggest, that those families that were doing more of these things would be healing a lot faster, would be, recovering a lot faster, and would be protected a lot more. So this is, take a break in about 5 minutes here. This is a res dog, my res dog here at sleep. So why do I bring in sleep and the importance of circadian rhythms? Because sleep exhibits such a strong effect on our well-being, right? And we need to keep our circadian rhythms sort of balanced and functioning, right? Because that's our molecular clock, that stays in sync with the sun and rising and setting, and the moon and all those different kinds of things. You can understand why our ancestors had sun songs. And you remember that rock they were drawing in the desert there, the sun sign. right? These were things that we know now from the, that our ancestors knew long before Western science was studying it. They knew that if our circadian rhythm clock breaks down, we get sick. And it's broken down for a lot of us. We're getting, heart disease, heart disruptions and rhythms and, diabetes and dementia. Our brain actually shrinks, when we don't get proper sleep, right? And why is that? Well, we've been colonized by, the industrial society, cell phones, the tablets, the laptops, televisions, all this floodlight society, what they call the blue light of doom, when you look at our laptops and so on. And we know that sleep is crucial for childhood development. It's crucial for elders. It's crucial for parents. Any sleep that's missed by anyone, whether it's an elder all the way down to a child, it affects their learning abilities, right? And when we sleep well, we know now from the, people sleep well. There's songs, sleep songs, and now people have white noise and all that sort of stuff in the background. But what we know that when people sleep well, that there are really important growth hormones that begin to become activated, to make us leaner and stronger and healthier. And a lot of these proteins that fight infections and keep our immune system strong, so get a chance to be released and kind of go on the they're out there sort of doing their surveillance in our system to find out, who are the enemies out there? How do they capture the enemies? Whether it's COVID-19 or the flu or whatever, right? That's why so many people that don't sleep well get so many flus a year. Not so much anymore now that people are wearing masks, but now we'll probably see a rise in that. Some people are banning their masks. But again, poor sleep affects our memory, language, difficult to learn, and so on. I'll do this last one, and maybe we can take a break here. So, it's really important to think about that. And again, if we were talking about, decolonized social work practice, we'd be saying, well, in order to have a healthy family or a healthy individual or a healthy community, we really need to work on helping whoever it is optimize their circadian rhythms, right? And, starting, like in the morning where, when people rise, from sleep and, the natural thing that our ancestors did to stop the melatonin release. I wrote about that in a book not long ago that we published about my father telling me the story about my great grandfather. His grandfather, his name was Plenty Fox. How he would get up in the morning, and the first thing he'd do, he'd sit in his bed, lay in his bed. My dad was little. My dad was raised by him for a little while until he was about age 7, about age 5 to 7 or 8, and spent time with him. But the first thing he did in the morning was he sang this get up morning song, right? So my dad said I'd lay there in the bed, I was just little, and listen to my grandpa sing, and then he'd get up and he'd tell me, Shishanu, which means come on, let's go, and go see the sun. And so my dad would go outside, and he'd be standing there, and my grandpa would sing, and he'd have his gourd, he'd sing to the sun. And even if it was cloudy and dark or whatever, he'd still sing to the sun. And my dad would talk about that. And he said when, of course, the sun was there, we know now from Western research that, when you get a direct look at the sun and the sun, penetrates your eyes and your body, then your melatonin release stops so that you're wide awake. And that's where you get your first, sunlight of the day, highest alertness and so on, best coordination, all the way down to, if you're caffeine drinkers, limit your caffeine. And of course, dimming the lights, the use of technology. And then all these things have to happen before your melatonin release starts, right? And so, the sleep industry right now is billions and billions of dollars because we don't sleep well. Indigenous people don't sleep well. We kind of lead all these categories. You asked about sleep. They sleep the least well of all people, right? And it's interesting to know, right? Because again, I think I can only speak for myself. I got this ancient body with all these genes, and I think I have to really pay attention to those things. And I think most of my family was like that. As we move along into the night, that's when this restorative sleep starts to take place. And this again, it's just, kind of a general overall marker. The deep sleep, this is when we have this period where the brain actually opens up and relaxes enough so that cleaning can happen. The brain cleans itself out. There's brain, chemistry and fluids that move through our brain and they haul out all the molecular junk of the day. It hauls out, amyloid proteins, which are a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, and tau and tau proteins. And interestingly enough, today, the colonization of the brain, in Western society we now know that the blood-brain barrier has not been able to stop microplastics. So now a lot of us have microplastics sort of bouncing around in our brains because of what's happens when you develop a society that depends upon these artificial kinds of things that are not sustainable, and they don't break down in the environment. Yeah, if you look it up, you'll see that that research is being done now to look at the microplastics not only in our lungs and in our bodies, but finding them in our brains now too. So that's I guess again for us as social workers to think about how do we, what is sustainable social work? What is decolonized social work? So getting into this period of sleep then is when your brain gets cleared out. And of course, then the whole system starts all over again. So it's interesting to know that, there's a 24-hour cycle in the physiology of all living beings, right? Including everything down to cyanobacteria, all these small forms of life. And it's for some people, it's 23 and a half hours. Some people maybe 24 and a half hours. So the circadian rhythm kind of varies, right? But it's clear to us to know that as social workers, that circadian rhythms are endogenously generated, right? They're kind of come from within. They're not exogenous, but for the most part, except they're modulated by internal cues such as sunlight and temperature, those kinds of things, right? And so that's why our ancestors indigenous people got to be so sensitive to climates, right? And to sunlight and exposing themselves to those kinds of things. Not only did it give them a nice load of vitamin D, but also, it helped modulate, the circadian rhythms. So it's, what's clear about it though, is the last bullet point is that, our brainwave activity, sort of goes up and down from let's say from a beta wave, which is kind of a higher wave, to a more relaxed alpha, then down to a theta wave, and then down to a real, kind of non-dreaming delta wave, right? Where you can be sleepwalking and have sometimes these very interesting experiences, right? And in order to do that, your sleep circadian rhythms have to be balanced, right? And the other thing about it is if they're not balanced, you're not sleeping well, of course, then we end up with a lot of issues around sleeping. And then there's, artificial sleep aids that are done, and that's how we deal with it, rather than, going back to a traditional way of doing things where you give people synthetic, sleeping pills. So I'm gonna stop here and maybe see if there's any questions, and we can also take a break too.
Feel free, if you all have questions, raise your hands or just unmute. It's also fascinating, just thinking about children, right? And how laughter in the classroom is sit in the corner, how much time is spent silencing children while their brains are growing. And for how many generations we've done this to human beings. It's kind of blowing my mind as you were talking about the laughter and the importance of that and the damage that we do as a society to children.
I don't believe I have this. I don't believe I have this slide in here, but I have a really interesting slide from Rwanda, where these after the genocide that happened in Rwanda, there was an interesting story that came out about how a lot of Western health workers were going to Rwanda to kind of help people to deal with the genocide that had happened. And it was interesting because some of the folks said that, we had to send away the Westerners because they came into our villages and all they wanted to do was go in these little dark rooms and talk about what had happened and remind us all over again what happened. And they didn't want to go outside, they didn't want to dance and sing, and they didn't want to be in the sunshine, which gives us life. So we had to send them away, So it's a really kind of interesting story about that, about how Western notions of healing are so much different, than indigenous people around the world. So.
Yes, and that also made me think about some of you that know me might know that I'm a board certified music therapist. So a lot of my work has been in the effects of music and singing and movement. And, I think a lot of what you're talking about, Dr. Yellowbird, also relates to the work that Peter Levine has done on trauma and stimulation of the vagus nerve, which runs from our, brain stem down into our sacrum, and all of those things that you're also speaking about, including laughter, including dancing, including singing, running. Those are all things that are stimulating to the vagus nerve, which is kind of the way that we discharge trauma in our bodies physically. So just, another supportive evidence of like indigenous wisdom, like knowing these things and practicing these things on a regular basis. Yes, and spoken word as well, Stacey, thank you. That these practices have been around, for as long as people have been practicing them, and we've kind of shifted away from that as we've kind of, gotten more in this clinical sense of like, well, it has to look like this. So thank you for like reminding us, of all the things that we have actually like really access to and accessibility to. Because right, it doesn't cost a lot of money to laugh,
Yep, absolutely. But that's not what accreditation is all about. Because I'm a dean on the accreditation, the Canadian Association of Social Work Education. We're not talking about like social workers learning how to do anything with dancing or singing or running or anything like that. It's like, there's, if anything, there's been another kind of push towards more clinical work, in the office and that sort of thing. Thank God there's a lot of good clinical social workers out there too that are doing some really creative stuff. So I'm gonna do this. What I'm gonna do is where's it at here? The chat. I'm gonna put that article I just talked about Rwanda. It's in the Guardian. So do folks want to take like about 5 just to get up and stretch, and then we can come back? Let's do that. Let's take about 5 minutes and come back at about. That would be what? That
would be 4:40 here.
4:40 your time. Yeah. So let's take about 5 minutes and we'll come back. Okay.
All right, thank you.
I have hope with compassion as my shield and faith down to my marrow. I will walk the pollen path even when it gets narrow. Yeah, I resurrect. Yes, you can bet that we seen the single mama raising children on the res. We seen domestic violence tear apart what we have left. We seen the alcohol take it all and leave us dead. We seen the children take their lives when they can't take the dread anymore. It's a war. Can't take the dread anymore. It's a war. No, we can't take the dread anymore. It's a war. No, we can't take the dread anymore. It's a war, but we've seen it all before. And now we know we can change it, 'cause that's why we were born. We know we are the ones that we have been waiting for. We are the ones Grandma has been praying for. So rise up, all you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I can feel it in my heart, can you feel it in your blood? I can hear the seventh fire calling us to wake up. Wake up, pueblo hermoso, levántense, es nuestro tiempo. No tienes que esconderte más, ahora es nuestro tiempo. Mujer indígena, tú eres tan sagrada. Traigas medicina de tu suelo todavía. A pesar del abuso de tu cuerpo y tu tierra, respetamos tus ancestros y la suya cultura. Hombre indígena, Tú eres honorable y yo veo la fuerza que todavía sobrevive a pesar del abuso de tu raza venerable. Yo respeto tus ritos, tus danzas, tus padres. Somos guerreros del amor y guerreros de la paz y no vamos a escondernos más. Somos guerreros del amor y guerreros de la paz y no vamos a escondernos más. They say that history is written by the victors. But how can there be a victor when the war isn't over? The battle has only just begun, and Creator is sending his very best warriors. And this time, it isn't Indians versus cowboys. No, this time, it is all the beautiful races of humanity together on the same side, and we are fighting to replace our fear with love. And this time, bullets, arrows, and cannonballs won't save us. The only weapons that are useful in this battle are the weapons of truth, faith, and compassion.
Welcome back.
It's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Wow. Powerful.
Really good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Welcome back, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. I'll put that link in the chat. It's just such a powerful video, and I always love to share it with y'all.
I'm back. Can you see my screen again? Yes?
Yes, you're good.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Okay, good. Can't see your faces. I've got the whole screen up. So one of the things I think that seems to be, I shouldn't say what I think, but it really appears to have such a amazing healing properties are ceremonial practices like sweat lodge and saunas and being in cold environments like our ancestors did. And the reason it's so important is that we know not does it make you feel get better and healing happens, but at the kind of the cellular level, we see that one of the things that happens when you're in a hot environment like a sweat lodge or a sauna, which are both indigenous, by the way. Saunas are come from Finland and Norway, places where a lot of the indigenous people use those there. But saunas and sweat lodges are kind of universal among a lot of indigenous people around the world. That there's a production of what they call heat shock proteins, HSPs. They're found in our cells, and they really play a vital role in our making sure our protein structure is resilient and there's a lot of integrity in there. And it prevents proteins from misfolding. So we know when proteins misfold as we get older that the signs of aging come on. All these different kinds of signs of aging. But what we know now too, though, is that when we engage in, let's say, sitting in really hot environments like a sauna for 20 minutes a day, 7 days a week at 180 degrees, and we kind of provide a little bit of mild bioenergetic stress to our body, or if we take a real cold shower for about 5 or 10 minutes, we get heat or cold shock proteins. Both of these shock proteins are indicators of healthy signs of longevity. If you have a lot of heat shock proteins, longevity, disease protection, healthy skeletal muscles, which again, then kind of a lot of different, indigenous groups, have very, strong bodies and thicker bones than people in industrial Western societies. And the key thing too is about how do you get, or how do you maintain the protein integrity, right? Something as simple as doing that. Some of you may do that. Some of you may, do saunas a lot, or some of you may take cold showers every morning. But it's beyond the health kind of thing now that we say, well, it's healthy for, but now we know it's happening at the cellular level. So we're getting this disease protection. And of course, something I talked about, cold water climates, cold water swimmers, um, ocean swimmers, using it now as a therapy for dementia. And it seems to, there seems to be a lot of promise, and so that's happening on that bit of research. It not only protects, but it's also, helps with the arresting of, the symptoms of dementia. I mentioned fasting, and again, I don't talk about it lightly. I talk about it because, so many Indigenous people living in Western industrial society, have really had health compromised. A lot of obesity and overweight, status, and so on. And the idea that, there are these different kinds of protocols, that exist, for fasting. But the idea is that, that we really evolved to fast. If I could pull up my genetic markers there quickly enough, but this is a kind of interesting slide, because two things come together here. And I'll show you in just a minute. So this is this Jesuit missionary, Paul Lejeune, who's among these Indian hunter-gatherers in Canada in 1636, Montagnais Indians. And he's writing in his journal, right? I saw them in their hardship and labor suffer with cheerfulness, right? And think about that. When hardships and labor, and you're really working hard, you haven't eaten, and you're still, laboring hard, but you're still cheerful. I found myself with them threatened with great suffering. They said to me, we shall be sometimes 2 days, sometimes 3 without eating for lack of food, and sometimes longer, right? Take courage, Shini. Let thy soul to be strong to endure suffering and hardship. Tell from being sad, otherwise thou wilt be sick. And of course, he was there to proselytizing among them to kind of tell them how to live. And here they are trying to rescue him from the depths of depression and hopelessness because he hasn't eaten for a few days, right? See how we do not cease to laugh even though we have little to eat. So a couple things come together here for me. The fasting was a very, very important part, or part of our lives of our ancestors, right? And they fasted a lot, right? And it wasn't always like they chose to fast for ceremony. It was that food was scarce, And so what our bodies did is they developed certain kinds of metabolic and genetic profiles to kind of deal with that hunger. But something else that to deal with the hunger too is, look at that, you see laughter? That's one of the things that we know from collectivist cultures, from that funny bone gene that I talked about, the 5-HTT-LPR gene, the serotonin transporter gene that I talked about earlier, about humor, laughing at their hunger, laughing at the lack of food. And if you've ever been in that place, in ceremony, which I have, that comes naturally to some of us after 4 days of not eating and drinking water. The only tool you have left besides your faith and your prayer is to laugh at the condition that's happening, because of course, we know that laughter is going to raise the BDNF and protect our brain. And it's also going to raise our endocannabinoids, which is going to blunt the pain of going without food. And also it's going to continue to increase, our response, in the sense that our cells get stronger. And the final thing that, like I said, I won't talk about it too much, but, when we fast and we go without food now, Western science shows us, and metabolic science and food science shows us that, we develop certain species of bacteria in our guts called Akkermansia eosinophilia. And these little boys and girls, and these little species, what they do is they are a signal to the body, of course, that we haven't eaten it. And what they do is they increase our fitness, our muscle tone, our leanness, our awareness, right? And they just sort of explode when we haven't eaten for a while, which is why now we know that in many cases, that why people who are fat don't get a lot of these diseases like diabetes or cancers or so on. cancer too, because when you go without food, your body enters into a state called autophagy. Auto meaning the body, and phagy meaning eating, so that the body then begins to eat up cells that are left there, and we experience, sort of, or reduce the chance of those senescent cells turning to cancerous cells. Anyway, so the idea is that we have evolved to fast, and again, it's something that we've kind of followed the Western world in that sense, in many different senses, even to the point of believing that we need 3 meals a day and snacks in between all of that, right? Which has been very difficult. It's been very hard on many people in my community, for example. You mentioned that I come from a large family of 15, and everyone in my family is either diabetic, on insulin, or has pre-diabetes. I'm the only one that doesn't in my family, and I'm kind of right smack dab in the middle of the family, because I try to live a very sort of ancestral, traditional life. Anyway, so that's an important thing to kind of think about. So what are some of the benefits? Again, when we think about benefits, this is something like social workers could do to kind of like help reduce, diabetes and obesity in communities, right? To be sort of the vanguards of this kind of research and talk about how important it is and how traditional it is, because it improves glucose regulation, loss of abdominal, sort of visceral fat around the belly, the maintenance of muscle mass, brings down blood pressure, heart rate, improves learning and memory, motor functions. There we go again, number 5. Look at this. Protection of neurons in the brain against dysfunction and degeneration in animal models of Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, stroke, Huntington's. And again, think about it, what I was talking about earlier. In the Western world, Western doctors and scientists talk so much about, by 2030, there's going to be this many people with Alzheimer's disease. By 2050, we're going to have a huge number of people with Alzheimer's disease, in the United States in particular. But, the prescription is not, for people to kind of live more holistically, like our ancestors did, but to, the discovery of the one single pill that's going to cure it all, which doesn't look like that's ever going to happen. But I think this is the thing that, social workers get into the medical field, they get into the field where, so, well, I'm going to, what do? I'm going to, kind of care for families that have, families with the dementia cases. That's like sort of trying to close the barn after the horse is already gone, right? And so that's what I'm talking about in terms of prevention, and in terms of the medicine wheel. That we know these things that Mark Mattson, who's a really kind of a top neuroscientist, who was at Johns Hopkins. I think he's retired now, but still does a lot of work. Has done all these research studies in intermittent fasting and fasting. So the last thing the last bullet point is that, what Mattson found is that fasting, of course, intermittent fasting, is not only beneficial for health, but it also, as I said earlier, imposes a challenge to cells, stresses the cells out a bit, like to our ancestors. And our cells don't just roll over and die. We get uncomfortable. But our cells respond to that challenge, and they enhance their ability to cope with the stress and resist disease, right? So, whether it's an emotional disease, whether it's, psychological disease, whether it's a spiritual disease, whether it's, going without food, or whether it's, physical, right? This is something that our ancestors did. And of course, we developed a profile for that. Being outside, again, is the last one, is that we know how important it is, for us to all be outside. And like I was talking about my grandfather earlier, Plenty Fox. My father, the first thing they did was go outside, and they got exposed to some of the blue light outside, from the sun, and turned off the melatonin. And so what people like Richard Lowe talk about, this is, it's almost 15 years ago, more than 15 years ago, 17 years ago. It's talking about nature deficit disorder, right? All this stuff that where we live now, in this proliferation of all these different kinds of things that have really diminished our natural world. and taken us away from that. I actually work with a group in the States right now that talk about mindfulness and being outside natural settings, because kids are so, and families are so distanced, from the natural settings, that they have to kind of learn how to kind of reconnect with natural settings and places. Not like this young woman who was, what's her name? I wrote her name down. Layla Jean, I think was her name. Running, through the mountains there, right? Being out in that environment and how healing that environment is, right? So we've got this, all this literature, but nature deficit disorder contributes to all these different things. The diminished use of the senses, of course, attention difficulties, health things, and also if you look down the last sentence, of course, the ecological literacy and stewardship of the natural world, we've become so distant and separated from that. We've got all these, got all these microplastics in our brain because they're ending up in the streams and the rivers, and no one's picking them out, and they're breaking down and so on. So that's kind of, all coming back to us. And what Love talks about, of course, is that the devaluing of independent play in the epidemic of inactivity. So what's really interesting about that is you can go back and you can look at a lot of societies and so many games that elders played. And I'm talking about physical, running outside, moving games, that folks did, and how much less people do that today, which is one of the reasons I'm interested in healthy Indigenous aging, because I just don't see that happening with young people taking their elders outside for walks and getting their elders to lift heavy things like weights and to run, to skip, or to play some game. It's like elders have become sort of forgotten. I know there's a lot of talk about how we respect our elders, but I just don't see that so much. And maybe I'm not in a place where that's going on, but see elders sort of sitting there and just kind of getting old, rather than still being vibrant and contributors. And I think that's one of the things too about being outside is that, my mother passed away when she was 94, a year from this past February, and she loved being outside. That was her favorite place to be, was outside in the sun. She loved sitting in the sun. She loved out being in the wind and so on. And she grew up that way. She was kind of from the old ways, that to be outside was to have good health, right? If you're not outside, you get sick. She said, if you stay inside too long. So what does all this mean then? And I know there's more here, and I'll get to the spirit part of it, but what it really means to me then is this idea that many things that we do, like if we're challenging ourselves to be outside, we're fasting, we're also, pushing ourselves to be in hot climates and cold climates, we're dancing and we're running and we're singing, all those different kinds of things, even sleeping well, all these different kinds of things then create, resilience, a resilient coping, when we stress our bodies, just not in huge ways, but in thoughtful kind of traditional kinds of ways. And you can see from this slide here, this is a really interesting slide because it shows at the front, in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, at the underside of it, there's an activation happening in what they call the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC. And when we're resiliently coping, like a lot of our ancestors did without food, or they're dancing without food, or they're going all day without food, and they're being in ceremony, or they're running long distances, or they're sitting in really hot saunas or sweat lodges, or sitting in ice cold water in pools, those kinds of things. These are all things that were done a lot, and as part of their lifestyle. And when they were doing those kinds of things, you can be sure that it was activating this resilient coping in the brain on the left side. The right side, you can see the lack of activation in the risky coping. So what we know about this is that, where the location of the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, as I said, is where it is in the mammalian brain, in the frontal lobe at the bottom of the cerebral hemispheres, like on the left side and the right side. This is the bottom. So, and it's implicated in some really important things: the processing of risk and fear, the inhibition of emotional responses like emotional regulation, so that we just don't become overly emotional about things. Whether it's trauma or whether it's fear, those kinds of things. That we have a really good sort of ability to kind of manage our emotions, right, and our emotional responses to things, and to process our risk and fear in a really thoughtful, measured way, and in our process of decision making and self-control, right? How we can do those kinds of things, and again, very thoughtful, logical, and very helpful ways without getting too stressed out. And the key part of it, it's involved in the cognitive evaluation of morality, right? So what we know about it, though, is this, that, we can overcome negative stress on our brains and the cognitive function by getting training to deal with high levels of stress and uncertainty, which can improve cognitive resilience. I challenge people, I say, go back and look at your tribe and find out what those rites of passages were that kids did that, that were challenging. I remember when I was teaching at Humboldt, I spent time with Yurok folks up there, some of the intellectuals and the elders, and I remember some of them telling me stories about how young kids swam in the open ocean in Northern California. It's cold, and they did that not just one, but that was part of their training, right, to get tough, right? And they ran through the mountains and at night, when it was dark, and of course there were grizzly bears and mountain lions and mountain spirits, and they had to run up those hills, right? They didn't have GPS, or they didn't have coats on or things like that. They just had their cedar skirts and dresses and clothes on, headbands and their prayer sticks as they ran through the hills, right? And ran through the mountains. And of course, they had to use all those things, right? They had to use good decision making and emotional regulation and so on. And when you get the training, it improves cognitive resilience. And so when we look at this particular slide here, then we see that, it's also involved in the cognitive evaluation of morality, the right thing to do, the right way to be, the right things to say, the right things to think, right? According to, your tribal orientation. And it made so much sense to me, and then I had a student that came in one day who knew I was kind of interested in this area and I was kind of writing in this area. He brought me an article from an anthropologist, in California that spent some time among the Yuroks and pretty much confirmed all the stuff, the things that, how the young people were trained, the young men and young women were trained, and they were, exposed to these kinds of, mildly bioenergetic, psychological stressors, but they were guided through that by, elders and family members and mentors and those kinds of things. But I remember the last of the paper, he was talking, this anthropologist was writing back in the 40s or something, in 1930s or 40s when he was with the Yurok people. He talked about how, he said, these people that had gone through this, that generation, he said, had all this ability to kind of process risk and fear and had this really, kind of really stoic and really courageous attitude and so on, and good self-control. And he said one of the things that was most noticeable about them was that, they were compassionate and generous and had a high sense of morality. And you had to. And that's exactly the way that the culture, prescribed this kind of teaching to young people. You couldn't commit, intimate partner violence or abuse in a village, right? It was just taboo. But, this was the preemptive strike to get children and young people, as they go into adults, to have this ability to go through these things that I'm talking about, right? That all increase their ability to cope, but also to, develop that cognitive resilience that I'm talking about. So now we know a lot more about where cognitive resilience comes from in terms of Indigenous people and in terms of things that they did. And of course, as I say, when you look at your own tribal group, you kind of figure out, where that's happening. This is my second youngest daughter, Pachiparinu, and that means the new moon, and she's a little meditator. And she was meditating, and I caught a picture of her because all my daughters have to, they choose to do it, but I encourage them and meditate with them. So one of the things we know about contemplative practices is it's not only about being aware of the present moment, but we are connected, influenced by a natural world and a genetic past of our ancestors. And our mind, is colonized, inherited, and sculpted by the thoughts we think the thoughts and emotions, beliefs of our ancestors, that we inherit some of those through genetic and epigenetic messengers in the foods we eat and the environment we are exposed to. So when we think about mindfulness and contemplative practices, it's simply this state of being mindful and practicing and maintaining this non-judgmental state of awareness. In the ceremony, what it means is same thing. We're not just maintaining a sense of non-judgment, but we're maintaining a sense of positivity and gratitude and awareness of what's happening in ceremony and song, right? So it kind of even moves beyond that non-judgmental state to say that, our awareness is filled with, in order to help prayer, we have to maintain a sense of positivity, maintain a sense of hope, maintain a sense of courage and morality, that kind of thing. Meditation, of course, is, how we do that mindfulness, whether we concentrate on a sound or object for a word or visualize, something and that sort of thing. But, it's all meant really to, reduce stress, to promote relaxation and enhance personal spiritual growth. And beyond that, community growth too as well. So when I do Indigenous mindfulness stuff, I use some of these models sometimes about, when you're in ceremony, you don't always not judge this ceremony, but you treat the ceremony as something sacred, right? And for a while, what's different between Eastern meditation and Indigenous is that we do attach to things, for a bit of time to help, lift those things, and we pay attention, of course. And of course, we accept the things that are happening. And of course, we're sometimes in the present moment awareness, but sometimes we're calling ancestors to help in the ceremony, or sometimes we're calling, those ones that are coming, yet to kind of help in the ceremony. So that's a bit of difference between, some of the more Buddhist or the mainstream mindfulness stuff is that, as Indigenous people, we have, when we're in contemplative ceremony, many of us kind of have that sort of approach. Mindfulness approaches have all these different kinds of things like walking and sitting, and all the way down to practicing loving kindness and open monitoring, and resilience training. We know that contemplative practices do a lot, to preserve our brain. They help us become more collectivist, so it's not an I center, it's more of a me center. It's very powerful to deal with with depression, and can rival, what we see now in a lot of research. It's just as good or better than a lot of antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication. Leads to white matter changes, gray matter changes, and volume changes in the brain. A few days of training improves concentration, reduces anxiety, social anxiety, can even help with addiction. I do work with schools, with Indigenous schools, sometimes other schools. But again, the contemplative stuff is the same, as running or singing. Running and singing will do the same thing. We'll have an attention aspect to it. It will have a compassion aspect to it, unless you're doing war songs or war dances. Or an emotional regulation, same thing, calming. So these kinds of contemplative practices are not just sitting practices, but they're with all the practices I've been talking about. When we think about trauma and what trauma does, and the amount of stress it does to the body, one of the first things, we think about is, kill the Indian, save the man, and these kids are at Carlisle Indian School. If you can imagine, all these children there being there and coming from all these different tribes. And of course, I'm a member of the Native American Boarding School Healing Association. And, we're there. And of course, we traveled to see, all these, children's graves and the cemetery that was there. Other things that happen, colonialism is losing our traditional homelands. And this is a picture at Fort Berthold of the 3 affiliated tribes. And of course, being forced to give away traditional lands, of course, which was very traumatic. And we still feel the trauma from those kinds of things. This here is one of my grandfathers, George Gillette, who was, when they signed away, he broke down into tears, of course. And, you can see all the really somber looks on the faces of these Indigenous men. And part of the thing is, I think they felt so betrayed, was that they cut their hair, they put on the white man's clothes, they learned the white man's language, and in order to kind of say, okay, we did everything that we're supposed to do. And of course, they still had their land taken away. We had our land taken away and rights taken away and so on. So, those are the kinds of things. And really what it does, if we start talking about the colonization of the mind, we realize that there are things like enzymatic colonization that happens to the brain, from chronic stress, from colonialism. And that when our brain is under this chronic stress for long periods of time, it gets flooded by a protein or an enzyme, called protein kinase C that breaks down these really delicate dendritic spines there. And so, dendritic spines are really important for memory and learning, and sensory experiences help with that. And of course, our learning is affected, right? But the more learning that we have, the more spines that we grow, the languages that we learn. But it's detrimental because, colonization and trauma can really do this to the brain. If you think about something like this, let's say this here was a little spine here that was about, safety or maybe even language that a child heard, just as a baby, and then through adolescence, and that child maybe went to boarding school where that spine was eliminated. So the language is no longer there. And that person went to adulthood, even elderly, that spine didn't come back because that person never learned the language after that. So that's kind of how this works. But imagine them being flooded with this kinase C where these spines are breaking down, right? And as they break down, that makes us more vulnerable to memory loss, of course, and then it makes us more vulnerable to dementias and those kinds of things. So it's what we do know is that things like mindfulness and things like everything I'm talking about, exercise and running, a healthy diet, fast, and all those things can kind of regenerate those dendritic spines and repair when the stress is eliminated. We know something too about at the molecular level that at the end of the chromosomes, we have telomeres. And the telomeres are there to kind of protect these chromosomes. And this is kind of the young chromosome. It's kind of an ageist slide, I might remind you. And the grandpa chromosome has got shorter ones. Longer chromosomes mean, healthy and of course youth. Shorter chromosomes, of course, is disease and so on. But it's very deceptive because even as people get older, different cultures that practice some of the things I'm talking about, good sleep, eating a traditional diet, laughter, hanging out with all your friends, and taking even the grandmother hypothesis, if you've ever heard of that, taking care of grandchildren, can actually kind of be a benefit that will give grandmothers more years of life. It's something that's being studied now in evolutionary biology science. But the idea that telomeres, are protective. They're protective for our chromosomes, and they actually kind of protect us from the diseases of aging, like cancers and tumors and diabetes, those kinds of things. But each time the cells divide, the telomeres get shorter, and they get shorter and shorter. When they get too short, and the cells can no longer divide. So these two things go hand in hand. Then the cell becomes inactive or senescent, or it doesn't really die. The body has to kind of clean it up, right? And unless the body doesn't clean it up, then that's when we're at risk for cancers, different kinds of lymphatic cancers, blood cancers, different kinds of cancers, tumor cancer, so on. The body will clean it up when people fast, which is why you see fasting communities that have less cancer, because, as I mentioned, autophagy, the body eats up all those mutated cells, uses them for the first line of food, which is why you probably see a lot of hunter-gatherer groups yet today that there's not so many of them left, but they just don't have the rates of cancer that we do in the industrialized society. So shortened telomeres are associated, as I said, with aging, cancer, and higher risk of death. What we do know is also, too, that at this molecular colonization, something we don't see as social workers when people are having a lot of stress and depression in their lives, that middle-aged people, who are physically active, have better aerobic capacities, but also longer telomeres than those that don't move, which gets all the way back to the movement and running slide, right? And I would just to say that if we did this sort of study on Indigenous people, we'd probably see something, that would show us that, their telomeres get even shorter without that movement. In fact, I did my mother's 23andMe DNA analysis and then sent it to other providers, and I could see where she had a lot of short telomeres that she passed on to me. So, which is why I try to live as a ancestral life as possible. So I don't, my telomeres are, get longer, right? Live a bit longer, but to be healthier. So in this other study, telomere lengths, this is the power of chronic stress, though. We're shortest for both depressed and healthy participants, right? So you could be working out at the gym, but you can still have chronic stress in your life. It could be hard difficulties at home. It could be race-based, hate crimes against you, or some kind of gender-based, crimes happening, or transgender-based, hate shown towards you or your children or yourself as an adult or a parent or whatever, that. So being healthy with that chronic stress, your telomeres are still compromised because it's hard to move away from that. And for those of us who have dysregulated cortisol, which is the fight chemical, and telomere lengths get even shorter. So this is why all the things I've been mentioning are so important to kind of for overall health: sleep, exercise, laughter, dancing, singing, all being outside, right? Sitting in a hot sauna, all these kinds of things are all things that contribute to that molecular decolonization, right? So you probably have intuited by now what happens to kids, right? So kids who live in these stressful homes, have genes that, express certain neurotransmitter is that, heighten the effect of that stress, things. And as I mentioned before, like cortisol and other chemicals do that kind of thing. And or norepinephrine, the alert chemical, those kinds of things are really highly charged, when that stress is there. Probably have heard about them, and people talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And you mentioning earlier the vagus nerve, right? When that kind of goes offline, how to get it back online. Well, think about this for a second. Children living in the most stressful homes had telomeres that are on this study that are on the average 40% shorter than kids that live in the most loving homes or settings, could be communities. Think about that for a second. Absorb that and think about wow, what does that mean at a molecular level? Well, it means that, what's happening molecularly is these kids are biologically older than their peers, meaning that they are going to get the diseases of aging much sooner. They're going to get diabetes sooner. They're going to get tumors sooner. They're going to get cancer sooner. They're going to have obesity sooner. They're going to, have all these different kinds of things happening to them much sooner because of the stress and the chronic stress that exists. And I was listening to Layla's song, and she was talking about, people dying and all this stuff happening on the res. I grew up in a situation like that. I grew up on a reservation. I saw it, I still see it. And to think about, a lot of these people don't get old enough to become elders, right? And I can imagine how shortened their telomeres must have been, and all the, chronic disease that happens to people at such early ages. What's really important to remember is that it doesn't just happen on the spot, right? Moms pass on shorter telomeres to their kids. They give birth to biologically older babies. I was one of those babies that was biologically older. I know that from looking at my genetic profile, right? I had more number of telomeres that looked like they were shortened. And of course, I was just writing in a book I'm working on now, as I mentioned earlier, about my mother's life as a as a little girl, and as a young woman. All of the difficulties that she was exposed to, really a lot. I mean, it was just mind-numbing when she would tell her children, us kids, what factors were involved in her life. But we know now from the research of Elizabeth Blackburn, who was actually, she's a heavyweight. She was a 2015 Nobel Prize winner studying telomeres, found that mothers who are exposed to these really difficult life factors shorten their mom's telomeres and they pass them on to baby, right? And of course, not only is diet one of those things, but there's all kinds of hate crimes, all kinds of safety issues, intimate partner violence, things that this Lila Jean was talking about. in her in that YouTube song. I was just thinking about that. Murdered indigenous women, and sex trafficking of indigenous women. Also, these really hateful memes and tropes of indigenous women, being these prostitutes or these drudges or these, all these different kinds of things, right? And that, those kinds of things are just there, sort of in the air, floating, and of course, the reality hits us, but it really hits, women in particular, and of course, there's a molecular cost to it, a molecular colonization we have to be aware of. I mentioned BDNF earlier, but this is the slide here that talks a little bit about really what it is in terms of, promoting neuron growth and stopping neurons from dying. We know that in some studies that, bullying, being bullied or feeling the stress of being oppressed increases BDNF levels in the brain. And that's what this little mouse experiment showed. And that the activated genes and the genes in the front part of the brain are activated, which also then produce social anxiety, withdrawal, and depression. Now, the increase of BDNF is good. We should all know that by now. It's good because it's important that it protects our brain cells and also it creates more brain cells. But we know that when that's chronic cell stress lasts too long and colonization is there, that the BDNF then participates in what's called this pathophysiology of depression and suicidal behavior. So those two things going on at once, the rise of these genes that are producing these chemicals that are these fear-based and alert chemicals and the BDNF going up, also then strike up this pathophysiology of depression and suicidal behavior within, which will give us a bit of an idea what must be going on in the brains of young people, when they start harming themselves, or even older people feeling the sense of depression. Just a really quick run through of this, we know that the brain has these neuroplastic changes that happen really quickly. Let me ask, how much time do I have left? I want to make sure that I.
You have all the time you want.
Okay. All right. Okay.
I would stay here for the 5 days with you, but
okay. So yeah, because I still wanted to get to the genetic stuff, which I think is really important. But so contemplative practice are really important, right? And we know that after this study by Posner and others in 2010, it's since been replicated many times. It was only 11 hours of practice, 30-minute sessions, 22-minute sessions, positive structural changes begin to take place in the brain, which improves the white matter, which improves the brain's ability to talk back and forth. This is my girl, Chiparino, again. She's meditating. But we know that longer and more is better, right? Decolonizing the mind, and significant lasting changes in just 8 weeks of practice. So you can imagine ancestors that did this all the time, all their lives, where their brains must have been, just really then what kind of memories they must have had, what kind of sense of self did they have, what kind of sense of compassion and empathy did they have for themselves, one another, and the world around them. And of course, how the reduction of stress, right? We know that in the brain, that there's another part of the brain that gets activated when we get into contemplative practices. And I said decolonizes conflict, right? It's the insula. And you see the side view, the back view, and the top view of the insula. There's two insula. And really what the insula is, has a lot to do with interoception of the body, what's going on in my body, right? From moment to moment. And scanning, how I'm feeling and generating this subjective sort of message back to us, right? But it also is really important because when you look at it, it controls our mental emotions, right? And regulates our body's sense of balance. And finally, this part of the brain is linked to controlling our negative emotions to keep us in that place where we have a sense of positivity and hope, right? And that's why mindfulness and all these other exercises I'm talking about really are really critical, There's another part of the brain called the temporal parietal junction, the TPJ, and you can see in the illustration here that when it becomes activated during meditation, it really boosts our ability to have this emotional intelligence, to read the mental state of others. And you can imagine, populations and cultures that did a lot of contemplative practices that could read not only one another in the village, but they could read their animals, their horses, their dogs, the birds, the weather, the earth, the land, the stars, all these different kinds of things that when you see, the writings and the history and the traditional stories of Indigenous people, they talk about having relationships with stars and the land and the waters. These things have a level of sentience that you just don't find in Western industrial society. Western industrial society has to go back to, Europe to find some of those things and some of the more paganistic cultures to find a connection to that. Right? They don't find that. You don't find that now. And people, talk about, some folks that, that had some kind of relationship with the earth, but, those are far and few between. But now more and more settlers are getting that relationship. But Indigenous people, we can think about how what must have been going on in that temporal parietal junction, that TPJ, and the ability to read the emotional state, of something in distress. There's a funny story that, and it's a true story, in my family. It's in a book called The Arikara Narrative that was published by this guy, Libby, I think in about 1920. So he spent time, with my dad's tribe, the Arikara tribe, and was interviewing all these former warriors and soldiers. But he got to talking to some people, and they were actually talking about their relationship with animals, and the village was somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where they were, in North Dakota, Montana, or wherever they were camped. And a grizzly bear cub wandered into the camp. There was a little cub, and it was lost, or maybe its mother was killed, or whatever happened, but ended up in the camp. And everyone was looking at it, and they were all, checking it out. And then this mother came out, and happened to be one of my relatives. And she looked at the baby bear, and it was going all over the camp, and it was crying, and it was crying. And people were just, what does that baby want? And so she looked at it. Of course, being a mother, she said, I know what it wants. So she go over and she gently picked up the cub, and the cub let her pick her up, and wasn't scared because it was scared people because it was been scared by being alone by itself. And she started to breastfeed it. Imagine that, breastfeeding a baby bear, with teeth. But she did. She breastfed it and kept the bear, and it kind of grew up with the kids. And one of my great grandfathers named Yellowbird was one of the kids that it grew up with. And after a while, it left. They probably just left the village or it left the camp. After it grew up a bit, after it quit, breastfeeding. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But she was reading this really emotional state of this animal. And probably their temporal parietal junction was very active. As a mother, to read the distress sounds of this poor little bear. So what does traditional Indigenous mindfulness look like in contemplative practices? I already went through this. I'm not going to go through that. So here's one slide. This, again, is one of my, people from my village about 1903 or 4. And so he's here, in the lodge, in this earth lodge. And he's there, meditating over these sacred pipes. They're very sacred among Plains people. And we now know what's going on in his brain. I mean, one of the things is that he's doing is he's looking at these pipes, he gets a sense of feelings of well-being because they're holy, they're sacred objects. They give a sense of happiness, joy, and bring about a sense of optimism because they're such powerful healing instruments. And just by looking at them, he can, that's what they're all about. I know that because I've been on a lot of pipes, and that's kind of the language of them. And even the language of them, you call it, it's, you call them, in my language, Diwarukte, which means they're holy, they're sacred. You have to, and you see it with awe. Of course, there's a lot of good research on awe, but there's also, you see it with a sense of like, wow, this is such a powerful healing tool, right? And when we look at if we were to use this brain image and look at baseline before he starts looking and praying over these pipes, we would see that the left prefrontal cortex, the hemodynamic blood electrical activity in his left side of the brain is detached. But once he begins the meditation, he's been doing it a long time, just like the TPJ that connects, his left prefrontal cortex is activated, strongly activated. It's connected. We know from a lot of SPECT imaging that's been done at the University of Wisconsin and I think it's UCLA, I think, and other. I think this is a slide I got from a colleague, Andrew Newberg. This is his slide. I think he was at the University of Pennsylvania. And they've done this on Buddhist monks or people that really get into these deep meditations and they're focusing and praying over a sacred object, right? And this has this, whenever people feel happy, joy, optimism, this part of the brain lights up. So we understand that that's what's going on. The other part of his brain then, there's a change, is here. There's some changes that go on, but there's also a change here in the occipital lobe, the seeing part of the brain. So he's looking at these sacred pipes and he's seeing, beyond the pipes, really. He's seeing probably the people that, brought the pipes, the people, the song, he's seeing the people singing the songs that were gifting the pipes. He's probably seeing, the trees, the sacred trees where the tobacco was laid down and the offerings were laid down to the trees before the stems were cut and made into pipe stems. And, he might even see, the long journey over to Pipestone, Minnesota from our part of the world in North Dakota by foot, and by horse. And by a camp going all the way over to Pipestone, Minnesota, over course of a month or so, walking over there, the whole village, camping out there and getting pipestone and then turning around, going back, seeing all these things. And of course, the bowl there, that the representation of what it means, the tobacco, the sacredness, and the joining of the bowl and the stem, how it creates, the prayer and pointing up to the cosmos and down to the earth and to all the directions, right? It's not just to the cosmos, but to all the directions. He sees that, so he's seeing beyond that. This is another one of my folks back in about 1903. Look at these guys, all these young men here. Some are a little older men, but they don't look like they're older men because they live a very traditional ancestral lifestyle. They look more like guys that are on some kind of soccer team, or they're CrossFit guys or whatever they are, and it's just from the kind of living that they do. But what's really cool about this picture is that I know a little bit about what they're doing. They're singing a sacred song to the cedar tree, which is really representative of grandmother or mother, right? Atnatawisa, which means mother, she's coming to help the people. And like a lot of cultures, a tree is a tree of life, like you saw in the earlier Sundance slide. And this particular one is the cedar, where the cedar is, the mother, grandmother, and the mother that gives life. And so these men are out there singing to their mother and their grandmother. And they're singing to the tree like it is really alive. Not like, I would be thinking like, because I'm, I don't have that capacity to go as deep as these guys go, because they live this every day of their life. And they sing to the tree about mother, and they're connected, and their acknowledgement, recognition, as this sentient being who stands there before them. And one of the things that happens then is they do this long enough. We know from the research now that Andrew Newberg and others have done in neurotheology, is that this part of the brain here called the parietal lobe, and I've showed you that before, the right side of the parietal lobe goes quiet, goes offline when people are getting into this really deep contemplative mantra or song or prayer that goes over and over again. And the more they do it, the more offline it goes. And pretty soon they're able to connect to the tree. Why? Because this part of the brain it expresses for spatial visual reasoning, right? The distance between the tree and them is real before this goes offline. It's like, I'm me and that's the tree. But when they start really engaging in this deep contemplative practice, the brain goes offline and there's no longer a distance between them and the tree. They actually become connected to the tree, one with the tree, if you will. They become the fragrance, the branches, the leaves or the needles in this case, the roots, all part of the tree. And we know now then how a lot of great spiritual leaders have had this experience across cultures, where they've had this transcendent experience, where they've connected to another world, or to another creature, or to a landform, or to the waters, or to other creatures, right? Because to them, it's not another creature, not a water. It's a body of life that gives life, just like the tree gives life. When it expires and releases oxygen, and it takes in our carbon dioxide. We've got that thing going on with the tree. So if you think about that for a minute, how amazing that must have been when people were doing these kinds of things. It's not just my tribal people. This is tribal people all around the world that were able to kind of do this through these contemplative practices. And when the parietal lobe, as I said, goes offline, this happens. And of course, I just threw this in here too. We can be assured that telomeres are being decolonized. They're lengthening. They're increasing in size, indicating a sign of longevity and health and well-being, emotional health, spiritual health. So if we kind of put this all together, I don't have all the slides here, but one of the things, this is the insula, and here we see this again. This is a Rickaraw man from back in the same time period, about 1903. Edward Curtis actually took these pictures of the so-called vanishing India. But if you look at them, you say, well, this is a Tibetan, guru or a monk sitting up on some platform here, and he's sitting in a kind of a semi-lotus position or whatever you would call it. But long before they heard about Eastern meditation and stuff, indigenous people have been doing this around the world. All cultures have done that. So as he sings a song, you see the activation in the language as he sings a song. Remember, we were talking about how when we look at a prayer scan, and if someone's singing a prayer song, remember I talked about how endocannabinoids go up. If they're singing a sacred song, not only are endocannabinoids going up, but look at this activation of the left prefrontal cortex, which is the activation of this one here, right? Joy, happiness, feelings of well-being. And the more they do it, the stronger that becomes. And we take that with us wherever we go. It doesn't go away. It's there. We can always draw upon it. But that's what contemplative practices are all about, and why they're so important. And of course, here we got the insula again, and controlling the negativity and promoting homeostasis. But here we also have brainwave activity we know is going on, that when this man is engaging in really, really deep meditation, he can reach a level of kind of an alpha wave. See that modulation slows down. He's in deep prayer, right? And then something happens at some point where, if they're doing it for such a long period of time, we know this from studying Buddhist monks who meditated for like 40,000 hours in their lifetime, they develop what's called a gamma wave. Not the Superman gamma wave, but a real gamma wave. And the gamma wave, what it does when you've done this for such a long period of time, really deeply, the gamma wave, what we know about it now from neuroscience is an indication that the brain is in a maximally sensitive state, that it picks up all kinds of things, right? So we know that this is how people, hear their ancestors. They speak to, the spirits that are around them, the animals, right? In the landforms, that kind of thing. The brainwave is at that level. And the other thing that not only is it maximally sensitive, but another thing that happens to the brain is that, research shows that it's using low or no power at all. That the brain is in a state where you could probably be in that state for days, because you won't get the mental exhaustion, because that brain isn't using any kind of power to think or anything like that. It's just there, it's just existing in that state. So I invite you to kind of take a look at that and look at, the low or no power of the gamma wave and the maximal sensitivity of the gamma wave. And you'll see the relationship that's been done by Western science to find out that this is what happens when we see, people meditating for several days and they get into that state. And it's a very healing state as well. So again, this gets back to instead of talking about Jane Addams and about Hull House, we should be talking about our ancestors and the ability that they had to create, this state where healing was. You know, they weren't getting handouts from Hull House or those kinds of things. Don't get me wrong. I think that was important at one time, but that just wasn't, you know, what Indigenous people did in terms of taking care of one another. It was a very different paradigm. So when you put this all together, we see that, you know, there's all these different kinds of things that are happening here. And you see that, you know, with these grandmothers here that are all singing for their children all around there, the blessing of the children, you know, it's affecting, you know, of course, the DNA expression, right? Their genetic expression is being affected. The telomeres are lengthening. The parietal lobe is going offline as they get into these long, deep songs. The activation of the left prefrontal cortex is taking place all at the same time, you know, where they're experiencing joy and optimism and they're, you know, calling in the spirits and calling in the ancestors to help heal. And of course, we're seeing a balancing of all the neurochemistry in the body, all the way from the serotonin, oxytocin to the melatonin, all the way around, norepinephrine, all the way over to, you know, dopamine and endorphins and acetylcholine and whatever. These things are being balanced, and things that we never knew that we had to bring into balance, right, to be complete whole human beings. But ceremony does that. Traditional living does that. You know, eating within the bounds and thinking within the bounds and behaving within the bounds of our ancestors is something that produces true health, true healing. So, I mentioned dancing before. This is something that, you know, when Indigenous people do that, this is on my father's tribe, our tribe, bear dances, you know, the power of the bear, right? And of course, mimicking and moving your body and emotions. And this is a Yupik dancer doing a seal dance, very powerful. But we know from a bit of Amy Cuddy's work and other people's work that when you move your body into certain positions, like this little wooden figure has its hands raised up, you know, what she's found in her research is that your levels of testosterone and your levels of oxytocin go up in the body. So when you get out of bed first thing in the morning, you know, you put your hands up in victory for 2 minutes and just hold your hands there to kind of raise your levels of testosterone, healthy testosterone, healthy you know, oxytocin levels, you know, bonding and love, and you know, and this is what people did. You know, the Indigenous people were doing all those kinds of things, which gave them the rises in that neurochemistry. This was an Arikara bear ceremony. I come from my mom on my mom's side is a bear society person. Right? So this is just some of my class when I was at Cal Poly Humboldt. Now I just Humboldt State in my MSW program, students meditating and practicing mindfulness. And this is when I was at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado, which is predominantly Indigenous students from all over the country go down there in Durango. When I was at North Dakota State University with students, we're practicing, you know, mindfulness in the classroom. And of course, working with nurses, you know, from all over the state that wanted to know how to work with Indigenous people. And I said, you know, contemplative practices are really big for you, big for them. With me and my daughters back in 2012, 10 years ago. And in Toronto, I was working with child welfare workers here and doing, you know, the mindfulness practices. And another group of child welfare workers here, you know, they wanted to know about, you know, healing and you know, how do we bring mindfulness into the practice, right? Contemplative practices into child welfare. So some elders and Indigenous people in Arizona from around the country, also, you know, getting into the contemplative practices from other tribes in California and Northern California, and, you know, desert tribes, and you know, Washington and Oregon, different Montana. I see people from Montana here. And again, when you talk to people, it's like, you know, these are things that we've always done. We've always done this kind of contemplative practice. You know, we do it in ceremony all the time, but now we know a bit more about the science. Then my daughter's practicing here. This is Arundhati and Solana practicing in one room, kind of doing what they call heart resonance, trying to get their hearts to beat at the same beat when they lean against each other. And then Bachiparino, you know, just back 2013, of course, this little kid here doing what she called her fruit meditation. Before she ate, she closed her eyes and she would meditate to talk about where the fruit came from, and the fruit has life. My daughter, Arundhati there, the slide, and of course, my daughter's in the background of our house in Fargo, and of course, their little brains activating. Which brings us then to the final part of the medicine, where the emotions and our genetic inheritance. And so, we talk a bit about genes. I won't talk too much about it, but what are they and what do they do? And we know now, that they have a very important role and function in our bodies, and many, many different kinds of things are happening, and studies are happening now that we know more and more. It used to be that in terms of dementias and Alzheimer's disease, that we thought, well, there was one gene responsible. It was the APOE4 that made people most at risk. Now, recent research has showed that there's signaling happening within as many as 52 genes, right? And what's getting those genes to express and function is our environment, the thoughts we think, the sad thoughts, the angry thoughts, the happy thoughts, the positive thoughts, the longevity thoughts, the foods we eat, the fluids we drink, the sugar, the water, the chlorine in the water, the plastics in our body, how much we laugh, if we feel loved, if we love others, if we care about, the world and we have compassion, if we run and move and exercise. It's not just one thing, it's a combination of all these things that set into motion, genetic expression. And like a lot of people say now in the genetic world, science says that, genes are not our destiny, but they also tell us that genes are the gun and our lifestyle, loads the gun, and pulls the trigger. So this is kind of what I understand in all my work working with Indigenous people, why we have a lot of suicide, a lot of depression, a lot of violence. Not in all communities. I don't want to overgeneralize here, but I want to tell you about my experience, what happened with me and still happening on my reservation, other reservations I've been to. There's a lot of suicide among young people, a lot of poor health among elders, and all these different kinds of things. So this is what kind of, again, I guess it really goes, genes load the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. I'm sorry, that's what I meant to say. So when we think about that, what about variants that we have? How can we get these to work for us? We know that there's a Fa genetic variant called the happiness gene. And what we know is that, it really depends upon where we live, right? And the people we have around us. And what we know about that is that some of the happiest nations in the frequency of this particular, happiness gene is, look at these two Aboriginal grandmas here just laughing and enjoying themselves. We say, well, you should feel bad because you're old, and they don't care about that. They're just going topless and they're being who they're going to be. They're grandmas. And so we see the prevalence of this allele, in the gene here. The more prevalence, and where does it get up to, right? And then we see that the percentage, right? So we start to go here about Peru. Look at that, percentage of very happy people, above 30%, and about, there's, the prevalence is about, 40,000 people per, I don't know, maybe a million or whatever it is, 100,000, whatever it is. And then we go up, and look at Colombia, right? And we, there's very happy people and number. So there's a correlation. We see this kind of line going up. Mexico, a lot of people with a gene and high level of happiness. Nigeria, Ghana, places that you wouldn't think, but then we kind of go down. I'm not sure why U.S. wasn't on here. I don't think Canada was on here either. Anyway, look at this: Iraq and Hong Kong and China, places like that have lower prevalence of the gene and less happy. But it could be, one of the things that could be culturally biased in one way is what happiness is. I don't know, but there seems to be a pattern here when you start looking at certain cultures that have may or may not have gender balance and freedom and sense of well-being and happy, laughter, those kinds of things. So the idea of this gene, though, is that it's important that people spend time around other people that are happy, right? Especially if you have this particular gene, especially if you have a funny bone gene too, right? So you've got two genes we're talking about. You've got the serotonin transporter gene, the 5-HTT-LPR gene that I talked about, the humor gene that the Montagnais Indians were laughing about at their hunger. Is going to, if you've got, the variants of that and the variants of this, and you can use them properly, and we knew about those, then chances are, you're going to be able to come a lot of stress with that kind of resilience. And a lot of it is, about epigenetics, right? How, our genes are modified, in the places where we are, right? Where we eat, where we live, who we interact with, when we sleep, exercise, aging, all these things, cause these chemical modifications that turn genes on or off. So, I always tell people, like, you have to understand that eating is, it's critical, right? Traditional foods are critical for Indigenous people. They should be eating a lot of fiber, eating clean protein, eating, and eating less and going without. But every now and then, feasting. Nothing wrong with a feast every now and then. Where you live, right? And if you live around people that you never interact with, or you live in a place where it's very oppressive, or in the city, and so on. And these are all things that are going to change. The exhaust from the cars and the plants, those kinds of things, and the asphalt and the concrete and the powders that exist. These things are all going to interact, and contribute to the changing of the gene expression. When you sleep, how much you sleep, exercise, all these different kinds of things, and certain diseases also, can be switched on or off, away from a healthy state, which is why we see what they call is the Nigerian paradox. Nigerians, studies have been done, Nigerians, and they have high levels of this particular gene called the APOE4, which is really related to Alzheimer's disease, but they have such a low incidence of Alzheimer's disease because a lot of them, drink from streams where they have healthy bacteria. They eat foods that are, fermented foods. They don't eat as much. They interact with each other, in collectivist dances and different kinds of things, right? That's the paradox, because they've got that gene. In the Western world, it's like when people say, you got that gene, everybody gets so depressed. It's like, I'm going to get Alzheimer's. But, we have those models that exist out there that show that, again, genes, are the loaded gun, but our lifestyle is what pulls the trigger, right? This is another gene called the COMP gene, and I'm talking about certain genes. Not that these ones are important, but they also are interact with other genes. So don't think that these are one all gene means all, but they are genes that show really important associations with certain things. The COMP gene is one that is kind of related to the warriors and the worriers, right? But it's also related to the placebo effect. My mom had 2 copies of the COMP gene. So she was a warrior. She was like 5 foot even, little native woman. And she prayed hard and she laughed hard and she was so curious about things. But also, she got through a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of hard things, hardships as a little girl and as a young woman. And, saw a lot of death in her time. But she marshaled on, she warriored on, but this particular gene also was placebo effect. It was like, wow, because my mother was also diabetic for, almost 50 years. And one time I remember, I didn't think about it until after I got her DNA tested, that she had a situation where she got an ulcer on her foot from her diabetes, and it got bigger and infected. This hole was just like so nasty in her foot. And I was living away at the time, and I was coming home, and I came to visit her, and she was, depressed about her foot. And she said, the doctor wants to cut my foot off, and because, it's not healing. And I looked at it and it's nasty. And so she said, I don't want to lose my foot. So I've been praying about it, she said. And I just listened to her, and she was talking, and I said, that's good, Mom, And then a couple nights later, when she went to bed, she got up next morning and we were out on her deck. This was North Dakota on the reservation. So we were sitting outside in the sunshine and she said, I had this dream last night. And I said, oh, what was it about? And she said, I dreamed about my grandmother. And that was my great-grandmother. She said she came to me in my dream and she whispered, and I was crying in my dream because I didn't want to lose my foot. And so she was telling me in my dream, she said, you're not going to lose your foot. She told me what to do, And I just kind of said, oh, okay, Mom, because her foot looked bad. And then she went to see the IHS doctor, and the IHS doctor really couldn't do much for her, but, he gave her something, and he put it on her foot. And then I was around, the community because I was off for the summer, so I was around for a few weeks. And after about 2 weeks, she went to see the doctor again, and then she came back. She was happy from her visit to the doctor. And I thought, gee, Mom, did they schedule your surgery? She said, no. Doctor says we're going to wait. And so by that time, I left and went back to my university where I was at. And then she called about 3 weeks later, and she said the doctors decided they weren't going to do the surgery. They weren't going to cut my leg off. And I said, well, what happened? She said, I'm healing up. I just sat there and I said, you're healing up? I said, yeah, I'm healing up. See, I told you, my grandma was going to come. Or she came and she told me I was going to heal. So I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I don't know what happened. So years later, I did her DNA test and I found out she had 2 copies of the COMT gene. And what this current science says and the research says is that you have a very, very powerful response to the placebo effect, right? If you believe you're going to heal, right? And I was like, wow. In this case, it's just been something she's been doing all her life. And so she already knew how to heal. But when she was troubled with this most difficult time of healing, when she called upon her grandmother in the ceremony, in the dream, wow, it just turned around. I was amazed, And then when I saw her genetic profile, I was like, hey, Mom, you've got this particular gene. All she said is, oh, really? Well, that's interesting. And she goes on telling her stories. But that's the power, I think, of that, for some people who have that gene. I don't have that combination like she does. I've got one side of my dad that's skeptical and a bit negative, and the other side of my mom's gene, which is, I believe, so I'm kind of halfway in between the two. The other genes, there's a couple more here that I think are really important to talk about, especially for when we're decolonizing and thinking about social work, is that there's a gene called ADRA2B. It's called a deletion variant, which influences this norepinephrine, which is a hormone. It's a neurotransmitter I had mentioned earlier. When this gene activates, we can produce more norepinephrine, which is this alert chemical, right? Stay alert. But what's really interesting about this particular gene and the research that's been done on that is that it also plays a role in our emotional memories. And this particular study showed that it played a role in this real-time perception of things, and they become more vivid. And individuals with this gene are more likely to focus on negative things, right? I'm one of I have this gene, and I pick out things that are dangerous or angry faces in the crowd. Not so much as I used to, because I've taken a lot of training to get away from that. But like being outside, I was telling my sons when they were little, and my daughters now that they're little, like, watch out for this, watch out for that. You could slip, you could fall in that sewer and float away, and my brain would see that. So I'd be always watching them and kind of marshaling them here and there. Well, it's really draining in the brain to kind of live in that way. Because what it does, and it does it to me. I was just telling my wife this today. I said, because I was working on my book, I said, it does cause people to perceive emotional events, especially the negative ones, really vividly. The smell, the sound, the color, the things you hear, the things you sense, and it gets really, really vivid, right? So if you've got, let's say, for example, if you had a very negative experience with trauma, which it is, It didn't even have to be your trauma, but someone telling you about trauma. And they explain to you, and all of a sudden, this gene takes over. And if you've got your own trauma, it's going to take over even more. Or you've had a boarding school experience, or your parents have, why they can't get over the boarding school experience or historical trauma experience, and they have to talk about it over and over and over again. This gene is activating, right? Or you've had a really vivid experience with racism or violence. This emotionally enhanced vividness is there. So you're the kind of person that would go to a scary movie, and that would stay with you, and it would be so real, and it would, raise your heart rate and, the hair on your arms and neck, and you'd think about it later, and pretty soon it would be activating when you would hear a sound like that was in that scary movie that would really make you scream or jump, right? Because this particular gene would be activating. And this, for all of us to remember, is why not one size fits all when it comes to trauma. Some people are much more susceptible to PTSD. I'm one of those people, and intrusive memories following a trauma. And it's hard to get over those kinds of things, because this gene is also a protective gene, because it tells us don't go back into that space, don't go back into that event, don't hang around those people, don't be into that experience or that environment, because it's going to happen again. So this particular gene, was also good for people who were like sentries or scouts, back in the hunter-gatherer days, that would always be noticing danger. So it had its place in society. Now, as we come up to today, when we're not watching out for those kinds of dangers and getting paid for those kinds of things, or doing that, but we're still doing it with our kids, we have what they call is evolutionary mismatch, a mismatch, because that brain part, stays on alert, and it causes more stress, more trauma. It disrupts heart rhythms. It disrupts, our gut and our emotions, and kills our good bacteria. So it's important to think about. It's not one size fits all. And I can almost bet that, there are a number of people in Indigenous communities that have this particular genetic predisposition, because they survived, their genes survived, because they were careful and because they were negative into this world. But now it doesn't work for us very well. This is the last one I'll show you here. And again, I believe this is important because it relates to the other genes, especially the ADRA2B. This is the NR3CL variant. And this particular genetic marker is being found to be a really important marker for the receptor to this, where this cortisol binds to it, right? And it has a lot to do with our level of sensitivity. I'm a very sensitive person. You tell me a sad story, I start, choking up and tears run down. I start writing my book and I start remembering these sad stories, and, it comes back to me. But I know it's a lot of that. It's not like I have historical trauma. It's because I was naturally gifted with that sensitivity to have these genes that sometimes are very important, that I can be very sensitive to people, but also very sensitive to trauma. I got an older brother who's a little over a year older than me, Vietnam veteran. And he was a special forces guy during Vietnam. He was an era veteran. He was a force recon with the Marines. It's kind of like the LRPs back in back in the Army, where they would take them and drop them on behind enemy lines, and they have to gather intelligence and come through the jungle with the cobras and the tigers and the enemy, and without food and mosquitoes and all these different kinds of things, and not say anything. So he was a force recon guy. He was a dandelion, tough. That's what dandelion kids are. You can wipe them out, dandelions, and napalm them and dig them up, and they're back next year. You do the same thing, they'll be back next year. These kind of kids and people can walk through fire. They can walk through residential school. They laugh at historical trauma and count coup on fear and death, right? And they're the warriors that paint themselves, and they, like dog soldiers, stake themselves into the earth, ready to take on death or the enemy or fear or whatever it is. There's kids like that, kids that went to residential school, Indigenous people like that. There's also the other kids who are the orchids, very sensitive. sensitive to the world, sensitive to tears, sensitive to stories. They're the ones that become the artists, the poets, the singers, the song makers. Those are the ones that can dig really deep into the human experience, and they can put it together on words, on a paper, in an article or in a book or in a poem, or they can paint it, or they can tell you a story about it. But they're very, very vulnerable, we know from the research, to, suicide, self-harm, depression, anxiety. But we know that from the research that the dandelions are strong, have a lot of good traits and strengths. The orchid kids, if you give them the support, if you guide them, you love them, they can do these amazing, amazing kinds of things. So it's the idea that, we were programmed, as I said earlier, by the thoughts and the feelings and the experiences that our ancestors had that we carried down to the here and now, right? Those are the things that we have to pay attention to. These are the things that our elders told us. They're left for us in stories, in songs, in medicine wheels, on rocks, in carvings on the walls, on totems, in pipes, in all these different kinds of things, in song, in ceremony. So this glucocorticoid receptor is part of the inheritance that we have that influences how sensitive we are to the world, right? Why we care about the earth, why we care about animals, birds, the winds, the dirt, the waters, the songs. These are, embedded in us. They're our legacy. And these are things we should understand as social workers. If we are ever to practice decolonizing social work, we have to understand that we live in a world where there's such a need to get back to this holistic way of being. So I'm going to stop there and end the slide and see if anyone has any questions.
Let's just all unmute and applaud that. Oh my gosh.
I'm here.
Thank you. Thank you.
This has been absolutely phenomenal, and I'm so honored that we have had your presence, Dr. Yellowbird. I have appreciated everything that you have shared today, and I know that I am going to walk away so uplifted and empowered and having more direction on how to go about, continuing the journey of decolonizing as a Native woman, as a social worker, as a mother, teaching my children and those paths I come across. So I'm just extremely grateful for everything you shared with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And that was Shamice. That was not, in fact, Amanda Barrios Griggs.
I
know your voice, so I knew what that was. Alex, do you want to just ask your question or do you want us to read it? You can just unmute and say hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you so much for your wise wisdom and for sharing so much research and so much work with us. I really appreciate it. I am very interested in how you live in a slightly different way, more traditional, that has kept your health up, because I also come from a very traditional family and all of them have diabetes, and I too am the only one yet to, but it's very concerning. So I was wondering if you could share with us some of your other ways of being that have helped you sustain a healthier way.
I think besides all the things I mentioned before about trying to get proper sleep, about exercise, running, lifting heavy things, laughing and dancing and singing, all the things that I do. I don't take cold showers, but I do a lot of time sitting in hot saunas and stuff. I try to do all these things and realize that these are traditional things, and eat healthy, and I fast a lot. But I think one of the things that I've learned, I think, about Indigenous people is that, and about my own lifestyle, is that I every 5 years I remake myself, I reinvent myself, I reinvent who I am. I learn new things that I never knew, and I practice things that I didn't know, skills that I don't have, that I never had. Even now, I'm going back to looking at taking another algebra course. I was not good at math, but I took a lot of advanced statistics. So, I do things like that, and I got to do this. And it's always, I think that's the key in learning how to. What's really been difficult for me, because I mentioned my genetic expression, my own trauma, was learning how to compartmentalize my thinking and the way I do things, to bring my energy all to this focus for healing or writing or thinking or whatever it is, and not let it be out there loose, kind of like fugitive power, man. I bring it here. And that's, when I look at the mental toughness literature and the training of world-class athletes and people who are world-class leaders, that's one of the things that the literature says, is that the people that reinvent themselves every few years, it's a very healthy thing for their bodies and their minds and their personality, and of course their ability to kind of engage at other levels, the ability to compartmentalize your thinking, not all the time, but when you're really focused on being creative or solving a problem, it's critical, right? It doesn't mean I'm also a very assimilative thinker, but when I'm trying to solve the problem, boom, I come right to there and I dive right in. I have to go down and I have to see the sunken ship. I don't just want to hear about it. I want to see what it looks like and get way down deep in there and touch it. And that's, and forget about how cold the water is if there's sharks. That's the journey we take, I think, and our ancestors took. They had to, in order to get where they were going to go. They had to, travel the land. They had to run into these obstacles, these challenges, but they had to get through those. And how did they get through those? As I mentioned earlier, they laughed their way through. They stayed together as a group. They were stronger, but they had to also compartmentalize their thinking to say that this is the end goal, right? The means to the end was focus, pure awareness, and resilience. So that's part of it, besides, training myself to have that mild, good energetic stress, going without food or running, while I'm fasting, or sitting in a hot sauna, or sitting there and working, or sitting there and forcing myself to listen very carefully without missing a word that someone is saying. Just focus. And that in itself, I think those are very healing kinds of things. The other thing I haven't done as well as my mother has and other people is I'm not much of a person that prays, But in one of my slides, I do show that belief, evolutionary science tells us that that's one of the things that helped us survive. It was an evolutionary advantage, was a belief in a higher power of something out there, whether it's the water, the winds, the great spirit, the great mystery. That in itself is something that uplifts us and gives us that psychological and evolutionary advantage. We can't lose that. And that's what our ancestors believed in. The essence of that tree, they sang to that tree, to those waters, those kinds of things. And we saw what happened to the brain when it went offline, the parietal lobe went offline. They had this, connection that really happened in their minds. And because of that, they probably went up to a level of a gamma wave where their brain was kind of at low or no power and maximally sensitive. And they were picking up all these things that we don't pick up. So it's striving for that, believing that, I may never reach it, but let's strive. Let's always strive, because our ancestors did. We wouldn't be here, any of us, if it wasn't for the striving our ancestors did. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you very much.
Right, and I see Sarit. A question.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for putting this on. And to you, Dr. Yellowbird, thank you. I'm a Master's of Social Work student, and I'm wondering, what do you see as like the biggest macro barriers to communities going back to these ancestral ways of living and traditional knowledge that you spoke about? What do you see as the biggest barriers that are facing the communities? And then I guess what would be needed in order to bring that back to the collective?
Yeah. I think, it's the will, I think, of the worker. I think that's what I see. I don't have it in this presentation, but I do have it in another presentation about this Aboriginal woman from Australia, his grandmother. And she single-handedly almost changed suicide rates in her community in Australia. I'll have to find that article and put it in the chat, or I'll send it to Tamara. But it was really interesting because it ended up being called the care factor. It was called the care factor. People labeled it that. But she got so fed up with suicide, and so, I've got to do something, that she just single-handedly got on the streets and walked from house to house, from place to place, building to building, and sat with everybody in the community. And when someone was having a bad episode, depression and anxiety, she sat with them all night, all day, cooked for them, encouraged them, spoke to them, and then they felt that care, right? She didn't care whether or not the Australian government was going to give her a grant, or that, the government said don't do this or that. She, and those are the success stories that when I look at Indigenous communities, that's a success story, single-handedly. There's a place called Alkali Lake in Alberta, where just a handful of people completely changed the alcoholism and the violence and the abuse in that community. There's a place in British Columbia, forgetting the place that's out on Vancouver Island, where the same thing happened, where just a few people just took over and said, we're tired of this. We're going to change the way things are. And they did, right? So I think that's, the Margaret Mead used to say that, right? Don't ever think that a small group of people can't change the world. In fact, that's the only thing that has done it. So it's that kind of thing. And I think as social workers, we had my annual review with my provost today. All the deans have to kind of go to the provost. And we talked about that today, and she was saying that, faculty are waiting for the provincial government to give them money. The provincial government's not going to give them money, right? And the faculty are going to say that we can't do this without money, right? And she said, we have to figure out how to change the culture of people so that we use our intelligence, and we use our resilience and tenacity to do those kinds of things. And that, what she was saying, in other words, is like, don't ever depend on the government, somehow figure out these creative ways to do those kinds of things. So if you were to find the care factor about this Aboriginal woman in Australia, I think you'd be impressed with that. And I was so impressed by these case studies that I see that we don't teach in social work. I don't know why we don't teach those, about these successful communities that have done it by, like Standing Rock, it was a woman's led, revolution, and also when you think about Deb Haaland, who was the first Interior Secretary in the United States, who was an Indigenous woman. I mean, think about that for a second. Like, how did she do that when she came from poverty and the pueblo she lived in and all those kinds of things? It was that, thing that we haven't taught well in social work, that cognitive resilience. People we can do that, and that's why I think it's been difficult for us to do. So structural barriers are going to be there. They've existed, since time immemorial. Sometimes they pay off and they work for us on our behalf if we get a government in or we get people in that really truly support us. But after 4 years, it dries up and we're back to ground zero again. So I think those are the things that I've seen. So I just encourage folks just to kind of, think about like, what can I do? How can I get my hands in there, and how can I contribute, right? And I think today we're at a place, in a crossroads, on the planet where, climate change is going to demand that of all of us to kind of just dig our hands into it. I mean, I can give you all the statistics and tell you all the stuff, that I've read and research that I've looked at, that today we have these microplastics coursing around in our brain. Is that going to be enough to change us? Because corporations aren't going to change. They're going to keep on producing plastics or whatever they can, as long as it produces a profit. It's a profit over people, right? So those of us who are social workers understand that. They understand that structural barrier that exists, that's always going to exist. And so we have to do like these Aboriginal grandmas did, And I mean, that's kind of my thinking about it right now. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I hope it is.
So helpful. It's so beautiful. Your 45 minutes is up. Like the structure of therapy, the way.
Oh yeah.
In our system, it is, as opposed to just sitting with someone and being present, and just so moved. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions or comments or?
Dr. Fuentes, I saw you light up. Did you have a question, comment?
Just thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and making yourself available, and the book that you've just made available to the world, free, for us to really tap into all of this and be able to learn more. I teach a mental health policy class at SDSU, and several of my students are here with us. And really the point of me trying to make this, and encouraging the students to come and join is for us to learn from you and think out of the box in terms of what we need to introduce in ideas in policy, right? When we're talking about changing or the transformation of the mental health workforce or the mental health system, what can we bring in that is, bring us back to things that really work? We're talking about, we put these terms of evidence-based practices out there and really putting such high value on, interventions that there's, this research on. But I think that there's a whole other set of literature that we're not really, including. Yeah. That needs to be included, that needs to be thought about and talked about and introduced in this language of, when we're proposing policy.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I'm just blown away by all of this today. It was very wonderful for me, very inspiring also. And so just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it.
It's Earth Tree. Go love a tree. Tell it you love it, thank it, or plant one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the legacy we have, to leave yet, that social work. And I think that's why land-based education and social work is so critical right now. So we just revised our whole BSW curriculum and added in a whole theme around land-based, education and the importance of that ecological social work. Mm-hmm. We're hiring, by the way, for a professor in that area. So, but
thank you. It's Earth Day. Tell a tree you love it and inhale when you're underneath it. It gives you oxygen.
Yeah. some of us are old enough to remember, well, I don't know if anyone here is, I'm certainly old enough to remember William Proxmire and the first declaration of Earth Day back in 1970, I believe it was. Yeah.
I spent the night at Grossmont College for the first Earth Day when it started.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay. So
How old are you?
I'm 67 years old.
Oh, you're a baby. I'm 86.
Yeah.
You know, unfortunately, you're in here with Amanda's name. Who is speaking with us? So we just want to honor you for being here and thank you so much for being here with us.
Spring into, and we have to spring into nature gratitude. And Earth Day began at Grossmont College, 5 people.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the 60s.
Yeah.
It got diverted though, but we need to appreciate nature.
Yeah.
Be a tree freak. If you can't hug it, get under it, inhale and love it. Say thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly true.
Well, it certainly explained when you were talking about the neuroscience of being outdoors, why I taught right here for 18 months. When we went home, I couldn't do it inside. I sat out here in the rain and the cold. I'm out here in my blanket and people would say, why are you outside? I'm like, I don't know. I can't think in there. So now I have the neuroscience of teaching on the patio.
Well, San Diego just got rated the 6th most polluted city in the nation. So get those trees in, whether they're in your kitchen window or in your yard.
Yeah. That's land-based education. I mean, that's really kind of where it's at these days, right? And what we're seeing now is shifts like, a lot of folks are doing what they call forest bathing therapy. Have you heard of that? Yeah. Walking out in the woods and being out in the woods, how healing it is, right? Like we didn't know that, but it's like, it's now becoming
especially if they're in your backyard or your front yard or your side yard.
Yeah.
Be a tree freak.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
So there's a shift going on. When
is your birthday, kid?
Mine?
Yours.
October 16th. You're going to send me a present?
No, you're dead center between my Sag and my son Scorpio. You're in a powerful center. Oh,
okay. All right. Well, I seem to get in those powerful centers, but it's not me. It's fun to be in those places. But a conversation like this, is so critical to me. I mean, it's what feeds me too. To know that there are other folks out there that are thinking about these things that are really serious.
You can jump when the snake chooses your path. And let it go by.
Right. So
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Amanda. So
not Amanda, I'm Spring.
Oh, Spree. Okay. Spring. Okay. Okay. Spring. Okay. Well, we need more of it where I'm at. So Any other thoughts or comments? I'm just so glad to have had a chance to be with you tonight, and I'm glad that you have found. Hopefully, you found the book that we made available, open access. I hope it's good for you. And
I will look for that and put it in the chat. So just to honor this gentleman and his heart. When I was proposing a decolonizing social work course, I talked to him about this new book that he'd written, and I said, "Oh, but it's so expensive." And he said, "Oh no." He and his co-author paid the publisher to make this book available to you all for free, and that is colonization. And I'm so tremendously humbled and honored for us to have been able to bring you here. Boy, it's been a long Zoom day. Let me be quiet now, but just thank you so much. I'll go see if I can get that link and drop it in the chat.
Yeah, well, thank you.
So amazing.
Yes. And, I just reflecting on everything that you've shared with us today, I feel like I've never seen myself represented in science, in like the literature that, like, when we try to research, like I don't see myself as a mixed Indigenous woman like represented very often. And so much of what you were talking to felt so like directly connected to like my own experience and how I experienced the world. And it was just really, really grounding and inspiring at the same time, to see that there's still so much potential and still so much for us to reimagine and explore within the field. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And Professor Ackley, thank you for watching my 2014 Decolonizing the Mind lecture. I'm glad it was helpful.
Thank you so much. I shared that with so many people. I was launching a program in LGBTQI plus and Two-Spirit. It was certificate program, leadership certificate program at the School of Continuing Studies at the University of Redlands. And I was sharing with a colleague in the chat, I didn't want to take up space here because I'm an ally and I'm not part of this community, but I learned from you, and I wanted my students to learn from you, and your work on decolonizing the mind really shaped the way that we structured that program, and it had such an impact on students of every culture and every gender and sexual identity, who also wanted to decolonize their experience in this world and collaborate across all those differences. I don't want to take up more of your time. I just want to thank you so much. It's such an honor to see you still doing this work and building on it and sharing it with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm glad it was helpful. Glad it's helpful. Glad when anything's, if I can contribute just a little bit, I'm happy. So,
Dr. Yellowbird, do you have that link handy? I had linked it in the proposed syllabus and then I could access it and I couldn't get it easily, but we can also send it out to the folks who were here.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull it up.
You sent it to me in a chat and I was thinking, I know I've sent it to people and I can't find it.
I think I can put it in right now.
You're amazing. Thank you.
Dr. Ackley, I feel like your statement speaks a lot to, the experience of folks that, maybe they don't align with this culture, but that doesn't mean that these things are still not true in their own culture, in their own identities, in their own experience. I love the idea that as a people, we learn from each other and when we're interdependent in that kind of way. So, just because, right, like you're not necessarily identifying as Indigenous doesn't mean that this information can't be absorbed and useful for so many other groups and identities out there. So I really appreciate you sharing and being here as well and sharing with your students too, because I think it's important that we don't just, silo thinking for only one group of people. Yeah, I agree.
Well, and to honor your wisdom and to pass on what you've shared of your ancestors' wisdom and your own current living wisdom. Certainly the students were of all groups, and you mentioned Standing Rock and the women leaders there. Candy Brings Plenty was one of the teachers of our human rights and global advocacy courses. Her as the Two-Spirit leader of Standing Rock. So yes, thank you. Thank you.
What was cool is I was living in North Dakota at the time Standing Rock was happening, and it's not very far from my reservation. It's downriver in the Missouri River, and I've got relatives and friends that live on the reservation, and went down there and visited a number of times and camped down there and saw a lot of people. I mean, these people were showing up. Like Neil Young was there, and that was the same week that Joan Baez became my. She was adopted into my family, and all these people were showing up. And it was interesting because. On the front lines, were a lot of social work students. They were there. They showed up. And I remember we were driving there because we had visited my wife's parents or people in Oklahoma, or in Wyoming. So we were driving home back to North Dakota. And we ran into some students in Bozeman, Montana. They were in a car park. They'd pull up in the station wagon, and they were off getting some food. And I saw their university sticker. And I said, "Where are you from?" And they told me. And I said, "Oh, what are you studying?" And they were all social workers going to Standing Rock. So, and allies. They were not Indigenous, but they were allies. And I said, "Yeah, I encourage you to go." So I think you'll see a lot of things going on. And of course, it was pretty dynamic. And like it was, there were so many people that were involved in that kind of thing that was happening. And all kinds of camps. It was so amazing. I don't know how many folks were there, but when you go to bed at night, your tent, you would get ready to bed down, and you would hear the Maori people singing, 100 yards away, and they'd stop, and pretty soon you'd see these Northern Cree Montana people from Alberta, or not Northern Cree from Alberta, Canada singing, and then you'd hear some Navajo singing, and then you'd hear someone else singing. All these different groups, then the Irish were there, and the Palestinians were there, and all these different folks were there. So it was a time that it was our Woodstock, I guess. 2016 Woodstock. So it was really cool. It didn't end so well. So, but hopefully we can turn the corner on that. Well, it's
We're just so
ready
great.
to go because it's about 20 to 9 here.
Yes, let's be respectful of your time. You stayed with us 40 minutes longer, and I think we'd originally told you 5:30. So, but when you ask how much time do I have, I'm going to say
Yeah.
as much as you want.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And again, working on another book called Decolonizing the Social Work Curriculum with the same author, Chris Clark. And she's from Fresno State, but she lives in Finland now. So we're working on that. I'm working on a couple of other things too as well, but we've already got that piece set for open access, so we don't have to fool around with that too much. So
that's fantastic.
Colonizing social work. So, but the other thing, tell you social workers, write. Even if it's just journaling, write about what you're doing and tell your story. There's going to come a time when people are going to read your story. They're going to want to read it. They're going to know about you and what you did. And that's, to me, it's a lot like how our ancestors left the petroglyphs in the walls. They left on Judicula Rock. They left the Turtle Island medicine wheel. In the Bighorn Mountains, they left the grand medicine wheel, the carvings. That's our legacy, and the social workers, we have to kind of talk about, what we're doing and kind of what we're moving toward, right? So I just tell people to write, share it with people, and we need that so badly. We need people writing to talk about this stuff so badly, and that's important to hear your voice. Even if you don't think it's worth reading, or you're sensitive about your writing or shy about it, please don't be, get it out there. Make yourselves known, because people are reading it around the world because of the world we live in. We're connected, and folks pay attention to it. And we're in a state where we need all the intelligence and crowdsourcing we can get to shift the paradigm.
Yeah.
And that's what I think this kind of writing is about, is crowdsourcing the ideas. So.
And for all of our students, there is more to life than APA format papers. I'm telling you.
Yeah.
Doesn't feel like it right now. And I know y'all got a bunch of them to go work on for the rest of the weekend to get through this semester, but I just wish you all well.
Yeah.
Thank you
So-
so much, Dr. Yellowbird, for being here. We had some folks ask if you would be willing to share your slides with the participants.
Yeah, I can. I have to send them in a Dropbox because it's huge.
Okay, yeah, if you want to share that with me,
Yeah, I
I
can
can share it out with everyone else.
Send me a reminder and I can do it. Otherwise,
Sure thing.
Yeah.
I'm finally making friends with Google Slides for the same reason, because my PowerPoints are too big to send.
Yeah. So, so this is not like the most recent iteration. This is an older, I've got a lot more slides that I included. So you'll see that at some point it'll come out as a book anyway. So, but you can have access to this too as well. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. That's so generous of you. Again, your wisdom today has just been so powerful, and I know everyone here is going to come out changed their perspective, and hopefully that'll ripple out into the rest of the community and the work that we do.
Yeah. And if you ever think about it, if any people are interested in the PhD, I'm really working hard to develop a strong PhD up here in Manitoba. So it's got Decolonizing, Indigenizing, international kind of focus. So and it has a lot to do with all the stuff that's going on in the world today. So I've been generous as a dean. I've been putting a lot of money into it, providing scholarships and tuition. So I have one of my students from California that's now attending our program. So.
Well, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I might apparently be going to Canada now. So
Amanda's like, I'm out. Okay, that's
we'll
it.
see. Yeah, I guess that's it. That's all that took. All right, everyone. Well, thank you all for being here. I will send out, some links for the recordings and the one from last week as well to anyone that was registered. And thank you all for spending your time with us at both events. We really appreciate your passion for our community and your interest in helping us decolonize and uncolonize ourselves in this work. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.